Y2K? What are you selling, chicken or sex jelly?
Haven't you heard? At midnight, every computer in the world is gonna fail.
These are their stories.
No! Don't!
Alberto.
Why not let celebrities sit on it and talk?
Bingo!
You never know where the conversation's gonna go.
Most of my audience is American, British, or South African. For the next 3 hours, I want you to imagine being from somewhere else as an exercise in objectivity to sniff out cultural bias. If you've watched this series from the beginning, you know I've repeated my birthday a lot. And an important exercise for me while writing and researching was wondering how different my life would be if I had been born on that same fateful day, not in North Carolina, but in South Carolina, or California, or the UK, or Rwanda, or Bosnia, or Afghanistan, or China. Would I still be lectual? Would I still be a lover of history? Would I still be doing the 90s? Would I even be alive? While each nation we're about to discuss had their own cultural struggles and differences, recurring threads of violence, greed, poverty, religion, misogyny, bigotry, and more bind these stories together. Journey with me through international responses to terrorism, mass shootings, environmental disasters, disease outbreaks, and ethnic conflict. In the final episode of Lectual Does the 90s, we'll be taking a trip around the globe at the end of the 20th century to understand more about our past, present, and future.
The United States was the first nation to recognize the State of Israel.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
I don't want to be emotional, but it's one of the greatest moments in my life.
Aye.
3, 2, 1, happy 2000!
Let's start where we hardly venture to on this channel. Australia. In 1996, The Crocodile Hunter, starring the Melbourne-born, Queensland-raised Steve Irwin, debuted. It hit America the next year and became popular internationally, to the point that Irwin was debatably the most famous phenomenon from Down Under, along with Kylie Minogue. The same year the conservationist and zookeeper hit television, a 29-year-old Aussie named Martin John Bryant became inspired by something he saw on television. His entire life, he had been considered intellectually disabled and aggressive, setting off a plethora of alarm bells as a youth and adult in his hometown of Port Arthur, Tasmania, a former penal colony and thriving tourist hub. On April 29th, he killed 35 people and injured 23 others using an assault rifle. Tasmania had the most lenient gun laws of the 6 Australian states. Despite backlash from conservative Australians, the tragedy led to Parliament passing the National Firearms Agreement, which restricted ownership of assault weapons and instituted a buyback program. 643,000 guns were traded for $350 million. In 1999, Australia held a referendum on detaching itself from the United Kingdom. While some monarchists were enthralled by the Queen and nostalgic symbols of royalty, and others simply didn't want a significant change in government or their way of life, Aussies in metro areas like Sydney and Melbourne wanted to turn Australia into a republic. Because the Australian Constitution could only be changed with approval in both the majority of voters and the states, out of 42 referendums since 1901, only 8 passed. And this 1999 referendum was not one of them. Australia remained a constitutional monarchy with 55% of 11.8 million voters rejecting a republic. Republicanism, or replacing a monarchy with a republic, was a pertinent issue in the late 90s. The end of the Cold War meant that being in the Commonwealth was less valuable to nations that had once been at risk of coming under communist influence. In January 1997, 2.5 million UK viewers voters voted in an ITV poll called Monarchy, The Nation Decides. After listening to Republicans and monarchists debate, 66% of voters said they wanted a monarch, compared to 34% who didn't. Reported the Irish Times, Britain was divided on the issue, with England and Wales supporting the monarchy, while Scotland was definitely against the royal family. In Northern Ireland, 64% were in favor of a monarchy and 36% against. Nearly half of those polled, 48%, believed the monarchy would not survive another 50 years, while 35% said they didn't support the royal family. Only 3% said the monarchy meant something to them, and more than a third believed Prince Charles would be a bad king. Another poll showed that only 1 in 5 young British people supported the monarchy. Times were changing. In 1997 in Scotland, a devolution referendum created a Scottish parliament, granting the nation more autonomy, along with Wales, who gained a national assembly.
Dithig Quech Meal
26,000.
Cant Indig.
So I think that's a yes all round.
The number of valid votes.
The final
cast
finishing
for the
post. Well, look at that.
Meanwhile, the Provisional IRA of Northern Ireland continued demanding sovereignty from the UK, but deferred on strategy. While peace talks had been occurring since the 1994 ceasefire, the group bombed a rail station in the London Docklands in February 1996, killing 2 people and injuring 40 more. The ceasefire had lasted 17 months and 9 days. Despite the bombing and 6 others, including in Manchester in June, peace talks and rallies followed, along with retaliations by the loyalist Ulster Defense Association. A new 1997 ceasefire announcement by the Provisional IRA caused dissidents to form the real IRA. On April 10, 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was reached by Ireland and the UK and ultimately passed with 71% approval in Northern Ireland. As a result, the nation was granted more autonomy via its own assembly. Unsatisfied, in August 1998, the real IRA detonated the deadliest bomb in Trouble's history, killing 29 people and injuring 220 others in Omagh, Northern Ireland. The tragedy brought new anti-terrorism crackdowns, a ceasefire, new terrorism plans by spring 1999, and a raid yielding rocket launchers. In 1995, the same year that British pubs were no longer legally required to be closed between 3 and 7 p.m., the 232-year-old Barings Bank, the second oldest in Britain, collapsed and was declared insolvent because of fraudulent trading by a young broker named Nick Leeson. One of the bank's biggest clients, Queen Elizabeth II. But this was just one of many headaches for the Queen. In October 1995, a Montreal radio host pretending to be the Canadian Prime Minister pranked her with a phone call, reported The Independent, believing she was speaking to the Prime Minister, who was fighting to hold Canada together. The Queen held a 17-minute telephone conversation at Buckingham Palace in which she agreed to deliver a television address calling for national unity. Quebec voters very narrowly voted against sovereignty from Canada in their 1995 referendum. Also that year, the Queen visited South Africa, the first royal in almost 50 years, symbolizing that the country was once again accepted into the international community.
Thousands of people lined Cape Town's waterfront. Many could remember the Queen's only other visit here almost 50 years ago. This time she's come as head of state of a foreign but friendly nation to endorse the historical changes brought about under South Africa's new head of state. The handshake with President Mandela marked the start of a tour that has immense political overtones for both countries. With Mr. Mandela was his granddaughter. It was a perfect setting for the grand ceremonial of this official welcome. The Queen, who's here too as head of the Commonwealth to which South Africa is recently returned, heard the national anthems of the old and new. At the President's official residence in Cape Town, the Queen demonstrated her high regard for Mr. Mandela by awarding him one of the most exclusive honours in her personal gift, the Order of Merit. He becomes only the second living honorary member of the order outside Britain. The other is Mother Teresa of Calcutta.
Soweto, the heart of the struggle against apartheid, cheered the Queen's arrival. Hundreds of school children in this sprawling township had been given time off to see her. And a sight unthinkable here just a year ago, children perched on the top of an armoured police vehicle. The Queen saw little of real township life, Instead, she was taken to a British-aided project that helps disabled people to earn a living. Many, like the man who runs it, were paralyzed by police bullets in the Soweto uprising 20 years ago.
We feel great, we feel part and parcel of the society, we feel important today.
Said then Deputy President Thabo Mbeki, it signals the strength of relations between this country and the United Kingdom, and I think it is particularly good that she has come so soon after the change of government here. Nelson Mandela visited Buckingham Palace the following year as a guest of the Queen, further strengthening relations. During an October 1997 trip to India, Elizabeth and Philip's journey to the site of a massacre perpetrated by the British Indian Army in Amritsar 78 years earlier triggered protests. In an act of contrition for Britain's colonial past, Queen Elizabeth came to this Punjab city today and paid 30 seconds of silent homage. She removed her shoes and laid a wreath of white and gold marigolds at a pink granite memorial at the walled garden, where a British officer administering martial law ordered 50 soldiers to open fire on a crowd of about 10,000 unarmed Indians protesting, reported John F. Burns.
Colorful buntings decorated this religious town, and a huge police bandobast was in hand to take care of the small group of protesters. All present in Amritsar to greet Queen Elizabeth and her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, during their day-long visit. Descendants of those killed in Jallianwala Bagh firing called for the Queen to apologize. Although the Queen did not tender a formal apology, the very fact that she laid a wreath in the memorial and showed her distress at this horrific incident was interpreted as a sign of atonement.
Continued Burns, some Indians delighted in the fact that the granddaughter of King George V, Emperor of India at the time of the massacre, had acknowledged the wrong done. But others were angry that the Queen, during her 15-minute tour of the site, had stopped short of the more explicit apologies that Japanese and German leaders have offered for atrocities in World War II. Bubbling alongside the Queen's diplomacy visits was the drama of the royal family. Take Princess Diana's November 20th, 1995 interview on BBC One. 22.78 million British people and 200 million more worldwide watched as the princess divulged intimate details of her private life and relationship with the royal family to Martin Bashir. The interview, which would later be investigated for being conducted in an unethical fashion, was so secretive that even the heads of BBC weren't informed that it was taking place, as one was married to one of Queen Elizabeth's closest pals. Diana, who had been separated from Charles since 1992, laid bare her experiences with postpartum depression, bulimia, and infidelity on her part and his. She said of Charles's mistress, Camilla Parker Bowles, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." Diana also discussed identifying with societal rejects and made it clear that she wanted to be an ambassador for the United Kingdom despite the firm's attempts to discredit her. Cheered Sarah Leal for the New York Times. Not only did she firmly defeat her husband, Prince Charles, in their battle for public sympathy, but she also succeeded in trading her fairy tale princess image for a new and more contemporary one. Feminist role model. Harsh members of the press, however, said Diana wanted to manipulate the media in public before announcing a divorce. The month after the interview aired, the Queen advised the couple to divorce. They filed in early 1996 and it was finalized on August 28th. Diana received £17 million in the settlement and an additional $400,000 a year. The former couple signed a confidentiality agreement that barred them from discussing their marital life, making Diana's 1995 interview all the more significant, wrote Edward Pilkington in The Guardian. In just 1 hour, in front of a viewing public of 15 million, she destroyed the image that generations of sovereigns have strived to create for more than 100 years, of a contented, caring, and united royal family. By contrast, the picture she painted of life in Buckingham Palace was of isolation, jealousy, and cruel scheming. Diana's stock rose while the royal families plummeted. In January 1997, as a guest of the International Red Cross, Diana visited Angola, then experiencing a brief period of peace, to raise support for an international ban on landmines. There were roughly 15 million of the devices left over from the 20 years of war that had ravaged the country, and 1 in 330 people had lost a limb. Diana walked through a minefield with the camera crew, stroking the anger of conservative British politicians. Diana visited Bosnia in August to meet landmine survivors and bring more awareness. 2 years later, the Ottawa Treaty of 19 1999 prohibited the stockpiling, production, and use of landmines, and 164 countries eventually signed.
Let us say to all the children of the world that you will walk again through the fields and climb the trees in the forests in the world free of mines.
Diana would not live long enough to see this victory or continue her various philanthropic efforts. Her level of fame and interest made her a frequent target of aggressive paparazzi. On August 31st, 1997, she and her boyfriend, Dodi Fayed, were killed in a car crash while being chased by paparazzi through a tunnel in Paris.
Dan, 7 freelance photographers remain in custody tonight as investigators probe whether they were in any way responsible for the death of the Princess of Wales and 2 other people. Police have also confiscated 20 rolls of film from those photographers. They're developing them and searching for clues. But also, here on the streets of Paris, people are mourning the loss of the most photographed woman in the world. The princess died in a tragic accident last night. French police say she and her companion, Dodi Al-Fayed, were trying to dodge paparazzi. Their Mercedes crashed at high speed in a tunnel along the River Seine in central Paris. Al-Fayed and the driver were killed instantly. It took more than an hour to cut Diana from the wreckage. She suffered severe chest injuries and died 4 hours later. With an investigation underway into the role photographers may have played in the accident, there was some anger today.
I think the paparazzi are guilty.
But most of those who turned the crash site into a memorial came just to mourn the woman who wanted to be Queen of Hearts.
It's very terrible. It's terrible.
She was the most loved member of the royal family, if she still is even a member of the royal family. She's the one that I think we all connected with.
Diana's former husband and her 2 sisters came to Paris to claim her body. Hundreds of silent onlookers lined the street outside the hospital where she died, her coffin today draped in the flag of the British monarchy.
Diana's funeral was watched by 2 billion people worldwide. Millions of mourners poured into London for the September 6th funeral at Westminster Abbey and left mounds of stuffed toys, flowers, and gifts at Buckingham Palace. Her friend Elton John issued Candle in the Wind 1997 in her memory, which sold over 33 million units to become the highest-selling single of all time. Large crowds who admired or who were directly impacted by Diana's HIV/AIDS, poverty, and landmine activism turned out to grieve internationally in San Francisco, Paris, Angola, Bosnia, LA, and Egypt. And as discussed in this video on my channel, the suicide rates rose by 17% in the weeks following Diana's death in the UK. The reputation of the royal family had already been under scrutiny, so Diana's tragic death caused more speculation and conspiracy theories. Fayed's father, Mohammed, who owned Harrods department store, believed that the crash was a conspiracy by the MI6 and the royal family, who didn't fly their flags at half-mast at Buckingham Palace to honor Diana. Overseas, American celebrities like George Clooney raged about the dangerous behavior of paparazzi.
Princess Di is dead. And who should we see about that? The driver of the car, the paparazzis, or the magazines and papers who purchase these pictures and make bounty hunters out of photographers.
And Diana was hagiographed as a victim of bloodthirsty paparazzi and the firm, even by media outlets who had once been extremely critical of her, leading to criticism by Christopher Hitchens and Yvonne Roberts. Wrote the latter in 1998, "Imagine this on 31st August in the year 2025. Your granddaughter reads of the canonization of Diana. By then, of course, it's common to hear of Princess of Wales dolls and miniature haute couture, who occasionally weep blood and have the gift of healing. While strips of her auction ball gowns are already treated as saints' relics, the recipients of whispered prayers invariably fulfilled the power of myth." Outside of the royal family and Princess Diana becoming like an angel, the UK had other problems. In December 1995, a gang of Filipino teens attacked a black student named William and Joe at St. George's Roman Catholic School in an affluent district. Headmaster Philip Lawrence intervened and was stabbed to death in the process. One of his killers, a 15-year-old, was convicted of murder. As a result, there was new legislation banning the sale of knives to people under 16. On March 13, 1996, 43-year-old Thomas Hamilton murdered a teacher and 16 5- and 6-year-olds at Dunblane Primary School in Scotland. 15 others were injured in what came to be known as the Dunblane Massacre. Hamilton had been under investigation in 1991 and suspected of being a pedophile and even flagged as unsuitable for gun ownership. Along with the Wolverhampton machete attack, in which a 32-year-old schizophrenic man attacked 7 people, including 3 children, at a school in 1996, there was a sudden re-examination of violence and security at British schools, as well as gun access. The knowledge that the Australian perpetrator of the Port Arthur massacre, Martin John Bryant, may have been influenced by the Dunblane massacre was jarring. The UK, then under Prime Minister John Major, didn't waste time introducing new legislation, banning all handguns that weren't .22 caliber. While the UK was quick to act on new gun legislation, little was done for police and racial violence. In December 1995, in Brixton, 26-year-old Wayne Douglas died in police custody while being investigated for burglary. The initial autopsy said he died of heart failure, pointing to his past history of heart disease, but later investigation revealed that, according to BBC, Wayne had been held face down with his hands cuffed behind his back on 4 separate occasions. Hundreds of black and white teens and young adults rioted in Brixton for 4 hours, summoning comparisons to anti-police brutality riots in Brixton in the 80s. Reported the BBC, hundreds of black and white youths have taken to the streets of Brixton, attacking police, ransacking shops, and burning cars. An official pointed out that it was not Brixton rioting last night. It was a small minority of thugs and criminals who, as ever, were looking for the opportunity to embark on criminal activities. 22 people were arrested. Said a 39-year-old named Harold Davis, "Last night happened because the only time a black man is seen and listened to is when he comes out on the street. They cause £1 million of damage, and then people start taking notice." In 1996, the same year of an asylum bill that restricted employment opportunities and appeal procedures for undocumented immigrants, nearly a quarter of black Brits weren't registered to vote. Operation Black Vote was created by black volunteers and activists to increase turnout. With the 1997 general elections on the horizon, organizers identified 50 seats where there were enough black and other minority voters to challenge politicians who ignored their interests. Wrote organizer Simon Woolley, "The challenge for Operation Black Vote is to break the cynicism and total disillusionment that many black people, especially young people, have with British democracy." A recent poll conducted for the BBC's program, Black Britain, suggests that 86% of 16 to 25-year-olds would not be voting at the next general election. While some media outlets attempted to tie OBV to Tony Blair and the Labour Party, Simon Woolley rejected this, writing to the Birmingham Post, "We are determined to ensure that no political party should take the black community's vote for granted." OBV worked to rouse black and youth interests, and voter registration rose, generating lip service by white politicians to become more equitable. Also in 1996, the UK announced that mad cow disease was a growing threat. Mad cow disease had been around since the 80s, and by 1993, 3 in 1,000 British cows carried BSE. But it didn't reach broader attention until 3 humans died in 1995. The following year, the European Union banned British beef and sales dropped by 1/3, leading to John Major declaring that the UK would stop participating in EU business if the ban wasn't eased. The EU didn't relent on the beef ban until 1999, after the UK agreed to cull some 67,000 cattle, but the problem would continue, affecting cows and other European nations. In 1997, the same year that the Bank of England separated from government control, it became easier for UK residents to bring foreign spouses home to live with them. Immigration overtook natural population growth in England and Wales as the Labour Party toasted its first Prime Minister victory in 23 years. At 43, the Edinburgh-born Tony Blair was the youngest British Prime Minister since 1812, bringing a sense of freshness to the staleness of British politics. Peanuts. That's all we're left with after 22 Tory tax raises, campaigned the Labour Party. Blair was a centrist, a triangulator, a neoliberal, like Clinton over in the States. Under his leadership, the Labour Party was distinctly different, summed up by the New Labour, New Life for Britain manifesto of 1996, which outlined the party's new priorities. These included no rise in income tax rates, stamping out National Health Service red tape, and using the extra money for faster treatment, acceleration of punishment for repeat criminals, cutting welfare and providing more jobs, and smaller classroom sizes. Clause 4 had also been removed from the Labour Party constitution, which mandated the advocation of common ownership of industry. The popular tabloid The Sun backed Blair, but with the stipulation by Rupert Murdoch that Blair would not transition the British pound to the euro. Said Margaret Thatcher, describing the new Labour Party, "I see a lot of socialism behind their front bench, but not in Mr. Blair. I think he genuinely has moved." After Blair's victory, Oasis band leader Noel Gallagher was criticized for visiting with the new prime minister at 10 Downing Street. "You have to understand that from when I went to school and from when I was born, all we ever knew was conservative, Tory, right-wing government. They say he went to meet Tony Blair. No. I went to meet the Labour Prime Minister. Our parents always drummed into us that the Labour Party was for the people and the Tory Party was not. I went to meet the Labour Prime Minister." Clearly, Blair was believed to be a fresh start from the Thatcherite conservatism and tough times UK citizens had grown accustomed to in the 70s and 80s. In addition to the election of an ambitious conservative woman named Theresa May, 101 women from the Labour Party were elected alongside Blair in the general elections, earning them the misogynistic title Blair Babes. In this famous photo, Tony was the center of attention, but he hadn't even been invited and actually crashed the photo shoot. People wondered what Blair's tenure would bring. Some even feared that the UK would adopt the euro, introduced in 1999 and adopted by 11 nations, who weren't the UK, including Austria, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Spain. After internal struggles within the Labour Party, Blair lifted the ban on gays serving in the military and created a national minimum wage. He also took the Firearms Amendment Act further, banning .22 caliber handguns as well. Also, Blair had a tight relationship with Bill Clinton, who skipped Queen Elizabeth's offer for a tea party during his first official visit to the UK in 1997 so he could gallivant around London with Tony and eat Indian food. Before the decade ended, Tony Blair ordered British troops into combat more times than any other prime minister, due to conflicts we'll be getting into. The longest-running black member of parliament, Diane Abbott, became a critic of Blair's reorientation of the Labour Party towards the center. Miss Abbott was outspoken on a number of black British issues, including supporting a House motion to investigate the murder of Stephen Lawrence. After the white gang who murdered Stephen Lawrence in southeast London in 1993 were acquitted in a series of trials through 1995, his parents Neville and Doreen continued to demand justice. The Daily Mail issued a paper with the perpetrators' faces and a headliner reading, "Murderers. The Mail accuses these men of killing. If we are wrong, let them sue us." Coupled with the House motion, Home Secretary Jack Straw launched a new investigation that would become the McPherson Inquiry. Not only did it lead to the eventual 21st century arrests and convictions of 2 of Lawrence's murderers, but it identified the police's failures and found the entire system to be racist. It offered 70 suggestions for reforming, including getting rid of the double jeopardy rule in murder cases. Jack Straw's son would enter the headlines when he was arrested for possession of marijuana amidst a growing momentum to legalize weed. In March 1998, roughly 11,000 people marched for legalization in London, including disabled people leading the protesters in wheelchairs. But medical cannabis in the UK was still a ways off. Tony Blair's election and initial years in power fused with the concept of UK pride known as Cool Britannia. British culture gained international attention in the form of the band Oasis and mega girl group the Spice Girls, literature like Harry Potter and Bridget Jones's Diary, and films like Trainspotting, The Full Monty, Shakespeare in Love, and Notting Hill. Canadian-British actor Mike Myers was inspired to embody and poke fun of 1960s British culture in 1997's International Man of Mystery, which spawned a franchise, including my favorite in the series, 1999's The Spy Who Shagged Me, which earned $312 million worldwide. Drug use, rocking parties and raves, and vibrant house and jungle music sets were also routine fixtures of Cool Britannia, cataloged in popular glossies like The Face, Dazed and confused, an ID. Said James Brown, editor of the popular men's magazine Loaded, "There's a heroin addict, a cocaine addict, and a marijuana addict on my staff. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's great fun." In addition to providing cues about proper British masculinity, Loaded captured popular British culture with a glossy appeal. Wrote David Camp, he holds up for inspection a centerfold from a recent issue, a 3-page wide photograph of a fresh order of fish and chips, magnified to about 5 times actual size. The oily repast in its camisole of stained newspaper is every bit as pornographic as Miss Auguste. The magazine, along with Maxim and FHM and other copycats, was emblematic of lad culture, a largely middle-class phenomenon in which young white British and Irish men performed exaggerated masculinity practices, typically associated with the lower class. Claimed Faye Weldon, laddishness is a response to humiliation and indignity. The girl power, female triumphalism, which echoes through the land. Speaking of the Spice Girls and their motto, the Brits also had the soft power of a new celebrity love story. Football bad boy David Beckham and Victoria Posh Spice Adams. Beckham reportedly received death threats in 1998 in the aftermath of being red-carded during the FIFA World Cup because he kicked another player. England was eliminated. Reported a newspaper, a radio poll in Manchester revealed that 61% of listeners never wanted to see Beckham play for England again. An effigy of Beckham was hung in the center of London, and popular tabloid newspaper The Mirror printed a special David Beckham dartboard so that fans could take out their frustrations on their fallen hero in the privacy of their own homes. Even if people hated Beckham, his skills, marriage to Posh Spice, their fashion choices, and lifestyle was valuable cultural currency for the UK. Over in Ireland, divorce and Playboy were both okayed in 1995 despite opposition.
I think people should be able to make up their own minds about what they do in their marriages.
Oh, and any country that has the divorce and has had it for a long number of years, Great Britain, America, these places, there's a big change there, and I think we'll go the same way. We'll go the same way, but I think there's an awful lot of people who have been unhappy in marriages, and I think they have to be taken care of. I think it's unfair not to give them a second chance.
Some people buy it for the articles, some people buy it for the photographs. And last week, the Irish censor decided that we could buy it too. What am I talking about? Playboy magazine. From December, it's going to be on Irish shelves. But are we ready for it?
I would buy Playboy.
Would you?
Because if someone wants to buy it, they'll buy it. If they don't want to buy it, they will not buy it.
I wouldn't buy it. I'm going to be on that age of looking at them now, wouldn't I?
No, I not. Because it's disgusting.
Yeah.
And what do you think your wife would say?
You'll have to ask her.
She'd probably look at it too.
Like Hello magazine, I might look at it in the dentist's surgery.
What would your wife say if she thought you were reading Playboy?
She wouldn't care.
The last of the Magdalene asylums, female workhouses that saw brutal assaults and exploitation, closed in 1996. 2 years later, a Channel 4 documentary on the sexual abuse at Irish Magdalene laundries led to hundreds of survivors contacting a hotline. It was a different Ireland, though checkpoints still dotted its border with Northern Ireland. The first Irish female president, Mary Robinson, didn't seek re-election after her 7-year term, and she had peaked at a 93% approval rating and went on to become a High Commissioner on Human Rights for the UN. She was succeeded by Mary McAleese, the first time in world history that a female head of state was elected twice in a row. Born in Belfast, she was the first person from Northern Ireland to be President of Ireland. In 1999, a documentary entitled States of Fear showcased decades of systemic child abuse of Irish children in reformatories and industrial schools, leading to a state apology and a commission on child abuse. In France, the April 1995 general elections were crowded with potential candidates, but ultimately boiled down to the centrist Jacques Chirac and the socialist Lionel Jospin. Chirac was elected, and the following month he announced nuclear testing would resume in French Polynesia to the outrage of the international community. In July, Chirac acknowledged France's direct role in helping deport Jewish people to death camps during the Holocaust, after years of French leaders placing sole blame on the Nazis. In October 1995, the largest general strike in France since 1968 began in backlash backlash to the Juppé Plan, so named because conservative Prime Minister Alain Juppé wanted to cut welfare and pensions. 60,000 Parisians flooded the streets on November 28th, disrupting the city and encouraging close to 1 million railway workers, teachers, and other public employees to strike on December 12th. I'm sure the croissants, brioche, crepes, and black coffee laborers consumed before returning to work on December 16th were extra delicious. That same month, 16 members of the Order of the Solar Temple died by suicide in a French mountain range. The cult was an amalgamation of Christianity, astrology, and medieval legend about the Order of Knights Templar. 53 members in Canada and Switzerland had ended their lives in the previous year. Reported Scott Kraft, many of its members were well-to-do and respected figures in their communities. They ate in expensive restaurants in Switzerland, always paying cash. Some members were said to have given as much as $1 million to the cause, and the group owned expensive property in Switzerland and Canada. After the protests and cult suicides, Chirac was bullied into stopping nuclear testing on French Polynesia by January 1996, only completing 6 of 8 planned tests. He'd signed the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty later that year, which nearly every nation signed and ratified except for India, North Korea, and Pakistan. And the countries to sign but not ratify were China, Egypt, Iran, Israel, Russia, and the United States. In 1997, France's Toubon law was put to the test when 2 organizations sued Georgia Tech University for publishing the website of its French campus in English. Georgia Tech was vindicated on a technicality, with the Associated Press writing, "The police court of Paris rejected the lawsuits because the watchdog groups, which are financed partly by the government, failed to file a complaint with the police before pursuing the suits last fall." Discontent with Chirac's conservative government continued to brew. In 1997, Chirac attempted to hold legislative elections a year earlier than scheduled, believing that right-wing candidates for the National Assembly would be re-elected. To Chirac's dismay, a cohabitation government was introduced when the socialist leader Lionel Jospin defeated Juppé to become the prime minister. As the president, Chirac held dominion over foreign and military policy, though funding allocation was done by parliament, with significant control by Jospin, who lorded over domestic policy. During his time as prime minister, Lionel Jospin sold state-owned firms to private buyers, lowered tax rates, introduced a 35-hour work week for the French people, and mandated health care as a universal right. During this period, unemployment fell by 900,000, and the military budget shrunk to just 3% of the GDP. In 1998, France hosted and won its first FIFA World Cup, notable because of the diversity of the team. The same year, doping scandals began to unfold during the nearly 100-year-old Tour de France. American cyclist Lance Armstrong, who had been diagnosed with testicular cancer in 1996, won the race 3 years later, and his drug use would be rumored. Over in Germany in 1995, Minister of the Environment Angela Merkel organized the United Nations Berlin Climate Change Conference, bringing greater recognition and commitment by world powers to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The Kyoto Protocol followed in 1997, providing a plan to reduce emissions that was voted by 84 parties of the United Nations to begin in 2006. Merkel was the protege and youngest cabinet member of Chancellor Helmut Kohl. The 4-time chancellor was losing popularity in unified Germany in the later half of the decade, and in 1998, Gerhard Schroeder was elected to replace him. Schroeder's platform involved being a social democrat who would grow the economy while still maintaining German social programs. Schroeder's neoliberal agenda caused the leader of the Social Democratic Party, Oscar Lafontaine, to resign from the head of the Ministry of Finance in protest. In 1999, Schroeder wrote and published an economic reform treatise with Tony Blair called Europe, the Third Way, advocating for welfare cuts, corporate tax cuts, and supply-side economics. Schroeder's party and image suffered into the new millennium. In the mid-90s, the economy of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, made up of Serbia and Montenegro, was collapsing from hyperinflation thanks to sanctions and helping Serbian rebels wage expensive wars in Bosnia and Croatia. In early August 1995, the Croatian army successfully defeated the Serbian rebels during Operation Storm, regaining lost territory. And by November, Croatians and Serbians negotiated an end to the conflict. Over the border in June 1995, a U.S. Air Force fighter pilot named Scott O'Grady was shot down in western Bosnia while doing surveillance. Bosnian Serbs combed the plane crash site and surrounding area for O'Grady for 6 days as he toughed it out waiting for a rescue mission. While O'Grady was picked up safely and Clinton and then National Security Advisor Anthony Lake enjoyed cigars to celebrate, members of both parties were upset that Clinton didn't then retaliate against Bosnia. For instance, Senator John Kerry suggested bombing Bosnian Serb missile sites. This came just 2 years after the failed operation in Mogadishu, at a time when most Americans polled were opposed to intervening in international conflicts. Even with the humiliation of the downed fighter jet, the Clinton administration did nothing, saying that it was trying to follow UN mandates. Shortly after, Clinton said he would consider committing United States ground forces to the war for a limited mission, but it was remote, indeed highly unlikely, that the US would further intervene in Bosnia. The very next month, over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed by Serbian forces over 5 days in Srebrenica, an area that had been declared safe by the United Nations. 40,000 people had crowded there for shelter, and the Dutch and American soldiers who made up the UN Protection Force were disarmed as boys were taken from their parents and soldiers raped thousands of Bosnian girls and women. It was the first legally recognized genocide in Europe since World War II. The slaughter generated fresh calls for American intervention and criticism for Clinton from both Republicans and Democrats. Inaction was now costing Clinton big time. On August 30th, Clinton implemented Operation Deliberate Force, sending 1,000 North Atlantic Treaty Organization airstrikes to destroy Bosnian Serbian forces. The warfare encouraged Serbians to negotiate an end to the hostilities at a military base in Dayton, Ohio, beginning on November 1st. The tense negotiations were brokered by Warren Christopher and Richard Holbrooke over 20 days, yielding an agreement that recognized Bosnia's borders, created a constitution, made everyone participate in the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and troublingly allowed Bosnian Serbs to keep their own territory and military. Summed up historian W. Joseph Campbell, the agreement rewarded Bosnian Serb aggression. The Dayton Agreement also empowered American peacekeeper rhetoric, with Clinton declaring, "The central fact for us as Americans is this: our leadership made this peace agreement possible and helped to bring an end to the senseless slaughter of so many people." Most Americans weren't excited that 20,000 American troops would be deployed with the international peacekeeping force mandated by the Dayton Agreement. But Clinton's success in Bosnia emboldened him after the mistakes in Somalia and Rwanda in the first half of the 90s. Yugoslavia's sanctions were lifted and it was officially recognized by the European Union in 1996. Slobodan, who served his maximum 2 terms as the president of Serbia, became president of Yugoslavia in 1996 through fraudulent means. He was immediately met with protests, which swelled in size and continued sporadically. In 1997, from New Year's Eve until March the next year, approximately 700,000 people protested in Belgrade, making it the largest so far. In Belgrade, the dissident students would form the protest group Otpor in 1998, which would play a key role in toppling Slobodan the next decade. As discontent brewed in Yugoslavia, Madeleine Albright stepped into her role as the new U.S. Secretary of State in 1997. Back when she was a UN ambassador, she had been an early advocate for military intervention in Bosnia, telling Colin Powell in 1993, "What's the point of you saving this superb military for, Colin, if we can't use it?" It was clear that Albright would be willing to intervene and grapple with Slobodan if need be. In the formerly autonomous province of Kosovo, a territory of Serbia, Albanians desired independence after years of oppression and discrimination. And their treatment by Slobodan was overshadowed by the Yugoslav wars, and they weren't a factor in the 1995 Dayton agreements. So under a shadow government organized by Ibrahim Rugova, the Albanians, who were predominantly Muslim, had been nonviolent. In the turbulence of the 90s, they moved to violence to garner more media attention. A faction of rebels called the Kosovo Liberation Army formed by 1996 and began attacking and killing Serbian law enforcement. With Albanians living in at least 4 different countries in large numbers, the last thing anybody wanted was a spike in Albanian nationalism that further destabilized the Balkan region and stroked other ethnic tensions. This might sound a little confusing, but stick with me. In the actual country of Albania in 1997, a governmental collapse brought about by corruption and pyramid schemes led to protests, 2,000 deaths, a robbery of the country's treasury, and widespread looting of weapon depots. Many of those stolen weapons found their way to the Kosovo Liberation Army. Milosevic ordered the Yugoslav army to invade Kosovo and root out the KLA, who wanted to provoke an international response through terroristic acts. The Yugoslav forces attacked 225 mosques and committed widespread rape, with at least 20,000 Albanian victims. There was a massacre of over 50 Albanian civilians in a small village in March 1998, and Kosovo Albanian women protested. Said Madeleine Albright, "We are not going to stand by and watch the Serbian authorities do in Kosovo what they can no longer get away with doing in Bosnia." On March 31st, the UN Security Council condemned Yugoslavia for excessive force, erecting economic sanctions and a weapons embargo. In October 1998, Milosevic was leaning towards a diplomatic settlement rather than more violence, even ordering most Serbs to withdraw and brokering an agreement for a ceasefire that ultimately broke down when KLA forces continued to fight. So, tensions continued to boil through the next year. Not only were 10,317 civilians, most of them Albanians, killed by the end of the decade, but 863,000 Albanian citizens were displaced. Madeleine Albright began 1999 by pushing for NATO action in Kosovo, but was met with resistance. The murder of 45 Albanian citizens in Rakak on January 15th cast a pall over an international peace conference in February and March. Despite Serbian delegates' willingness to work towards peace, the negotiations broke down when NATO added a requirement for a military annex, granting NATO free and unrestricted passage and unimpeded access throughout the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And Yugoslavia was like, what the hell? Hell no, obviously no. So they recoiled and the odds of a diplomatic settlement waned. In March 1999, NATO ordered airstrikes against Yugoslavia in Operation Allied Force, which continued until June. The legitimacy of these airstrikes was argued by some to be a violation of international law, while the US and Europe claimed it was required to end the humanitarian crisis of misplaced Albanians from Kosovo. Russian President Boris Yeltsin was pissed and claimed that if NATO moved to a ground war, Russia would join in. And he wasn't the only one angry. Grumbled South African President Nelson Mandela, "When two nations take it upon themselves to police the world without getting the authorization of the United Nations, we must condemn that, because it can lead to another world war." Mandela and others were troubled by Western powers' ability to police the little guys. As for Americans, they were conflicted. Most Republican congressmen didn't want to get involved in Kosovo, despite Clinton administration attempts to sell the conflict as purely good versus evil. Other Americans saw intervention as the answer. Wrote Paul Starr for the American Prospect, "America and NATO could have ignored or merely protested the murder, rape, and expulsion of the ethnic Albanians, and that is most likely what the United States would have done if the majority in the Republican House had controlled foreign policy, as was apparent from their votes on April 28th, failing to support not just the possible use of ground troops, but even the air war already in progress." As always, the military action had larger consequences. The April 23rd airstrike bombing of Radio TV of Serbia was one of the most controversial, killing 16 civilians. On April 26, 1999, the execution-style murder of British news reporter and personality Jill Dando outside of her home in London caused a massive investigation that would later be theorized to be a retaliation for the airstrikes by Yugoslav extremists. On May 2nd, Jesse Jackson traveled to Belgrade. toured with leaders and clergy, and negotiated the release of 3 American prisoners of war, without permission from the Clinton administration. 5 days later, China was enraged when NATO airstrikes in Belgrade hit the Chinese embassy, killing 3 journalists and injuring 20 more, setting off anti-United States protests. And we'll be back to how China reacted to this at the end of this episode. In the end, NATO's airstrikes had the desired effect, and in June 1999, the Yugoslav army fully withdrew from Kosovo. A NATO peacekeeping force entered, and for the portion of Americans who cared about Kosovo, the Pew Research Center found 2/3 of the public now says the United States and NATO did the right thing in conducting airstrikes against Serbia, and approval for the strikes rose to 62% in the final days of the campaign, up 9 percentage points since May. In Belgrade, thousands of citizens protested Slobodan. Said a protester, "Go away, go to Cuba and study Stalinism there." 600,000 Albanians who fled during the war returned to Kosovo, as Kosovo's Serbs left for Serbia and Montenegro, fleeing a new threat that NATO airstrikes hadn't crushed. Wrote David Gibbs in Was Kosovo the Good War? Following the Serb defeat, the NATO and UN peacekeepers effectively placed the KLA in power throughout most of Kosovo, and the Albanian guerrillas promptly used their newfound power to ethnically cleanse the Serbs through a campaign of violence and intimidation. Between 400 and 700 Serbs were murdered in the first 8 months after the NATO victory. To intervene or not to intervene? Let's travel now to Russia in 1995, where Boris Yeltsin was dealing with ongoing hostilities with the Islamic territory of Chechnya. In June 1995, over 129 people were killed when 119 rebels took an East Russian hospital hostage, securing the perimeter of the compound with explosives. 2,000 people were held for 5 tense days by the Chechen rebels, the first such incident in modern Russian history. Russian special forces mounted a series of 3 botched attacks that resulted in several dead hostages, eventually causing the Chechen rebels to release all of the pregnant women, mothers, and children. In exchange for freeing the remaining hostages, the rebels were given safe transport back to Chechnya. The entire incident would provide ample criticism for Yeltsin, who was campaigning for re-election. The following year, during a fragile peace with Chechnya, Mikhail Gorbachev, who had risen in esteem in America and was hated in the former Soviet Union, decided to throw in his bid for the presidency. Wrote David Remnick, "He is despised by the communists, who regard him as no better than the CIA, despised by the great power nationalists, who believe he is responsible for the humiliation of a great power and its army, and despised by liberal Democrats, who feel he never fully shed his allegiance to the nomenclature that raised him." Gorbachev's rating in the opinion polls rarely goes higher than 1%. Running as a social democrat, Gorbachev posed himself as a more centrist candidate than neoliberal Yeltsin and Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov, who seemed to be leading Yeltsin in the polls. Yeltsin was advised to cancel the 1996 elections due to his unpopularity and dictator tendencies, but he wasn't as unpopular as Gorbachev. Gorbachev was so disliked that the media barely paid him any attention, and he was allegedly slapped or punched in the face on 2 separate occasions. People attended his rallies just to see a fallen leader and call him a traitor. In St. Petersburg, while on the campaign trail, officials snubbed Gorbachev by refusing to allow him to tour the local factories. In the end, he received 0.5% of the vote, placing 7 out of 11. Russians were essentially made to choose between a return to totalitarianism and the alcoholic Yeltsin, who underwent quintuple bypass heart surgery in November 1996 after downplaying his health issues for months. Yeltsin had the support and election meddling of the Clinton administration. He privately encouraged Clinton to not back Zyuganov, making Clinton reply, "You don't have to worry about that. We spent 50 years working for the other result." The U.S. Treasury Secretary helped push through Russian market reforms to speed up IMF disbursement loans and relieve the Russian economy for more Yeltsin support. The $10.2 billion loan from the IMF, endorsed by Clinton, was announced in February 1996 and helped Yeltsin surge ahead in the polls amidst propaganda that the alternative would be societal collapse and regression. Yeltsin won re-election by over 13 percentage points, though there were allegations of voter fraud. Yeltsin also funded his campaign through the Loans for Shares program, or rigged auctions for state assets, fattening the pockets of oligarchs. While Yeltsin worked out a formal peace treaty with Chechnya that included autonomy for the Chechen, Gorbachev, defeated, accepted an offer from Pizza Hut to star in a commercial that filmed in November 1997 in Red Square.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев.
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Писахат.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
Gorbachev refused to eat the edge pizza that was being advertised and was paid nearly $1 million to star with his granddaughter Anastasia in the commercial, which aired the following year internationally, but not in Russia. He said, "I thought it was a people's matter. Food. This is why if my name works for the benefits of consumers, to hell with it. I can risk it." While the edge pizza being marketed didn't last, nothing said the era of Soviet Union communism was dead quite like this fast food commercial. So the commercial didn't air in Russia, and they didn't really need to see it anyways because the economy was struggling. The payments from that $10 billion IMF loan were repeatedly delayed and withheld because of Russia's lax tax collection, and smuggling, drug and sex trafficking, and other illicit trades grew. The trafficking of women in Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union reached new levels by 1998, when journalist Michael Spector exposed the grimy industry in an article titled "Contraband Women." These women ended up everywhere from Israel to America to the teeny chain of US-controlled territory between the Philippines and Hawaii called the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Wrote Spector, "Economic hopelessness in the Slavic world has opened what experts call the most lucrative market of all to criminal gangs that have flourished since the fall of communism. White women with little to sustain them but their dreams. Pimps, law enforcement officials, and relief groups all agree that Ukrainian and Russian women are now the most valuable in the trade." Spector added, "Israel is a fairly typical destination. Prostitution is not legal here, although brothels are. And with 250,000 foreign male workers, most of whom are single or here without their wives, the demand is great." Police officials estimate that there are 25,000 paid sexual transactions every day. Brothels are ubiquitous. Said one Israeli pimp and club owner, Jacob Golan, "Israelis love Russian girls. They are blonde and good-looking and different from us, and they are desperate. They are ready to do anything for money." When asked if the women were there voluntarily, the pimp said to Spector, "I don't get into that," he said, staring vacantly across the club at 4 Russian women sitting on a low couch. "They are brought here and told to work. I don't force them, I pay them. What goes on between them and the man they're with, how could that be my problem?" As trafficking women continued to be profitable, it became a key facet of post-Soviet nations. On June 1st, 1998, Russia defaulted on its debts, causing the collapse of the ruble and a financial crisis. Cash reserves plunged to a frightening $14 billion. After a failed impeachment in early 1999, in August, Yeltsin fired his entire cabinet and appointed a new prime minister, Vladimir Putin. In September, a series of bombs detonated in 4 Russian apartment buildings, killing over 300 people. Chechen rebels were blamed, but they denied being the culprits. The attack, along with a fight in Dagestan between Islamic Chechens and the Russian army in August through September 1999, helped launch the 8-month Second Chechnya War. Putin's handling of the crisis boosted his popularity, and it has been alleged that the bombs were a false flag operation intended to create support for a new war on Chechnya. Bill Clinton criticized Russia in November 1999, saying, if the attacks on Chechen civilians continue, the extremism Russia is trying to combat will only intensify. Yeltsin warned Clinton to stay out of Russian affairs and noted his hypocrisy in bombing Yugoslavia. But Yeltsin himself was withering in power. Revelations of a bribery scandal were the last straw, and Yeltsin resigned on New Year's Eve 1999, installing Putin as his successor. Putin's first act was declaring immunity for Yeltsin for life. Allegations of human rights abuses of Chechens by Russia rose as fighting continued for the next decade. In January 1997, the island of Cyprus announced that it would be installing surface-to-air missiles made by Russia. Turkey objected to this and threatened an offensive strike, a war, and a blockade, which the U.S. State Department criticized as dramatic. Mind you, Turkey and Cyprus have had beef since Turkey invaded in 1974 and declared its own republic in the north, and after months of tension, Turkey began searching ships in September 1997, and it was rumored that Greece and Russia would fight Turkey if it made good on its threats to attack or blockade Cyprus. Ultimately, Cyprus folded, and the missiles were instead sent to Crete. A war would not have been good for Turkey, who in 1999 experienced a 37-second earthquake that killed 17,000 to 18,000 people. The damage was so vast that the government enacted a tax on communications, real estate, income, and more to raise billions. According to Reuters, the cost of the August 17th quake, which hit Turkey's industrial heartland, was compounded by a second tremor 2 weeks ago, which killed at least 749 people. Tens of thousands of people have been left homeless. On November 4th, 1995, purported two-state solution Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an extreme right-wing Israeli law student named Yigal Amir. Moments before the assassination, Rabin had spoken with a group of people calling for peace. The same man touted as the Intifada bone crusher when he served as defense minister died with the lyrics to Shir La Shalom, or Song for Peace, in his pocket. Under him, Israel's settler population grew by over 20,000, displacing Palestinians from their homes and businesses. His 25-year-old killer Yigal rejected the Oslo Accords, which had been strengthened just 2 months previously, creating the Palestinian National Authority, a limited self-government, and a mutual recognition of Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which some would interpret to be the groundwork for a two-state solution. But Rabin wished to provide an entity which is less than a state to Palestinians, not an actual fully sovereign nation. Reactions to the assassination of Rabin varied. Some Palestinian moderates mourned what seemed to be their last chance at a peaceful resolution, while radical Palestinians rejoiced. In January 1996, PLO chairman Yasser Arafat was elected the first president of the Palestinian National Authority in a landslide, but without radical Palestinian opposition, like Hamas, participating. They weren't fans of the conciliatory partial government or Arafat and his two-state solution, which affirmed Israel's right to exist. Wrote Mustafa Omar, the PLO claimed that it represented the interests of all Palestinians. In reality, it has always served the interests of the Palestinian bourgeois, especially this class's desire to form its own mini-state through negotiations and compromise with the US and Israel. It has never wanted to rely on popular struggles of Palestinian or Arab masses, which could endanger the stability of both it and its Arab allies. Still, Rabin was a slightly different shade from his conservative critic Benjamin Netanyahu, leader of the Likud party. Rabin had been heavily criticized by extremists like Netanyahu, who spoke at rallies in which crowds called for Rabin's death and depicted him as a Nazi for desiring to give an entity which is less than a state to Palestinians. Yigal Amir, like other indoctrinated right-wing Israeli extremists, saw the peace accords as forfeiting land to the enemy. Israeli culture, identity indoctrination, and increased violence was thrust under the microscope. Said John Kiffner, Israelis are now grappling with the fact that the killer was no crazed pariah, or even one of the fervid Americans many here regard as an alien implant. He was a Sabra, a native, a studious Jewish boy brought up in the most revered institutions. The killer had learned moral absolutism in religious schools and the uses of violence in the army. Said an Israeli historian in 1995, I look into the future and I'm really worried, scared, and frightened. This dangerous inflow of boys in their formative years who have gone through a brainwashing. This is poisoning the army. In 10 years, when half the officers are religious, the government will be restricted in its decisions over evacuating the West Bank. It will lead to mutiny. Israel was fractured between the liberal and the conservative, with right-wing rabbis calling on soldiers to defy orders to withdraw from Palestinian land, the same way they would resist an order to eat pork. Reported John Kiffner on Amir's school. The students were the flower of a growing nationalist religious movement that was changing the country. And they saw peace with the Palestinians not as a blessing, but as a curse. Not just wrong, but as a sin. As a wave of Islamic fundamentalist bombings stunned Israel and rabbis issued religious warnings defying the government, Mr. Amir and a tight circle of friends drawn from the university, the army, and religious schools began stockpiling guns and explosives. Hugo and others were emboldened by ultra-conservative politicians and rabbis in an increasingly fanatical religious Zionist movement, though Amir was also notably driven to kill because he was rejected earlier in 1995 by a romantic interest and her family for being Mizrahi instead of Ashkenazi, showcasing the intricate web of discrimination within the Israeli community. Rabin's murder triggered early prime minister elections by acting Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who hoped to pursue the two-state solution and exploit his party's growing popularity to push through a peace agreement with Syria, who offered full peace, tourism, and business deals in exchange for Israeli withdrawal from the Golan Heights, which they had occupied since the 1967 war. Some, like Israel's ambassador Itamar Rabinovich, were hopeful that Rabin's assassination would push through the peace process.
Very firm determination in the Israeli government and in the Israeli political system to push forward with the peace process, that in addition to all the original reasons for being in the peace process, there is a very strong sense that late Prime Minister Rabin left a legacy that we all want to uphold.
Others, like Senator and presidential candidate Bob Dole, were more accurate.
It's a major setback, and certainly everybody's going to have to reassess, going to slow down the process some, because he was, as somebody compared it like Nixon going to China, he could do that. Rabin could give up territory because of his military record dating back to the 1967 war, and whether or not anybody else has that capability.
Under Israeli law, Peres could be in charge until October, but he called elections in May, despite pressure from the U.S. to not do so. Peace talks with Syria came to a grinding halt. Rabin's widow Leah attempted to continue her husband's work. Wrote Lauren Bloomfield, in the days after the murder, this blunt, tough-minded 68-year-old woman denounced Netanyahu, passed the mantle of leadership to Peres, and met with Israel's longtime enemy, the Palestinian Liberation Organization's chief, Yasser Arafat. Her choices were not the norm in Israel. Described Bloomfield, "I don't deal with politicians' wives," snapped one political commentator when asked about Leah's future. "In Israel, there are no Evita Perons. She'll fly to America and they'll treat her very well there, and that'll be it." As Peres and Netanyahu battled on the campaign trail, early 1996 events turned the elections in the latter's favor. Netanyahu benefited from the February suicide bombings by Hamas on Jaffa Road in Jerusalem and another attack in Tel Aviv. Described Serge Shimon, a grim Prime Minister Shimon Peres went before reporters to outline what he described as a war in every sense of the word against Hamas. He outlined measures to include extensive new barricades along the dividing line between Israel and the West Bank, and he ordered hundreds more soldiers and policemen to provide security in Jerusalem and on public buses. Peres ordered Arafat as leader of the Palestinian Authority to eradicate Hamas, and he carried out a series of raids on Hamas that continued to sour his popularity with Palestinians. Over in Lebanon, on March 30th, 1996, 2 Lebanese men were killed by an IDF missile, which Israel claimed to be an accident. Hezbollah responded with missile attacks, leading to Peres launching Operation Grapes of Wrath on April 11th. After dropping leaflets warning to evacuate, the IDF attacked the Shiite region of South Lebanon to push the population into Beirut, overwhelming Syria and Lebanon into, in theory, rooting out Hezbollah.
Israeli aircraft bombed a second Beirut power station, cutting electricity to parts of the city. In the capital, Beirut, still working to rebuild itself after 13 years of civil war, panic in the streets as Israeli warplanes continued their attack. Israeli gunboats wait offshore, warning of future attacks on the city. Its people can only watch and wait. 10 people were injured in the latest round of attacks, one of them a Hezbollah fighter, raising the death toll to 30. In the south, Israel launched its first attack on Tyre. Israeli warplanes slammed missiles into the port, trying to destroy Hezbollah bases in a town largely abandoned by its frightened population.
Roughly 400,000 people scrambled to evacuate, and over 150 civilians were killed, causing an international outcry about human rights. Most of the deaths were in the village of Kana on April 18th, when Israelis fired at a United Nations compound. Israel claimed that it was in self-defense, which was later disproven by video footage and a United Nations investigation. Israelis later claimed not to know any civilians were hiding inside of the compound. Soldiers speaking under anonymity to an Israeli paper said they were encouraged to kill the civilians. In a 1996 opinion piece by Ari Shavit titled "How Easily We Killed Them," he wrote, "We killed them out of a certain naive hubris, believing with absolute certitude that now, with the White House, the Senate, and much of the American media in our hands, the lives of others do not count as much as our own. Believing we really have the right to instruct 400,000 people to leave their homes within 8 hours, and that we have the right, when those 8 hours have passed, to treat their homes as military targets, and that we have the right to drop 16,000 shells on their villages and small towns, and that we have the right to kill without being guilty." In addition to the casualties from Operation Grapes of Wrath, approximately 2,000 buildings were destroyed, causing over $500 million in damage. Hezbollah did much of the repair work and even compensated aggrieved Lebanese people whose businesses were destroyed. Said Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, "Israel wanted to put pressure on the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah, which we shall not do. In the long term, the solution is for Israel to withdraw from Lebanese territory. Then Lebanon would be responsible for its own security in that part of its territory bordering on Israel. The Israelis are now asking us to disarm Hezbollah, while they themselves are continuing to occupy our territory." On April 26, Israel and Lebanon agreed on a new ceasefire, and Israel continued to occupy parts of the country. In May, the Israeli general elections were held after this violence, casting the two-state solution peace process into scrutiny and powering up Netanyahu. While Perez got 97.5% of Israel's Arab voters, Netanyahu narrowly beat Perez, beginning the longest non-consecutive premiership in Israel's history. 145,000 voters cast blank ballots, and 12,000 of them were by Palestinians. So the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin contributed to worsening Israeli-Palestinian relations and further turned the two-state solution into an alleged extremist view. In October 1996, it was reported that Netanyahu opened an exit in the Western Wall tunnel for tourism, which was seen as a violation of a holy site, sparking Palestinian protest. Netanyahu also greenlit the clandestine Operation Musical Charm and concluded that the Oslo Accords would fall through. His administration began making plans to conquer and dissect more Palestinian land, while Jewish extremists harassed Palestinians. For instance, in December 1997, 2 men were arrested for plotting to throw a pig's head into a Jerusalem mosque during Ramadan. Earlier that year in May, Israel celebrated its 50th anniversary.
And President Clinton and I are proud, as are all Americans, that the United States was the first nation to recognize the State of Israel 11 minutes after you proclaimed your independence on the 5th of ER 50 years ago.
The occasion was marked with Palestinian protests. Israeli soldiers opened fire on a crowd of protesters and killed 9 people, including 2 8-year-old children. Per usual, this went underreported. In fall 1998, Bill Clinton convinced Yasser Arafat and Benjamin Netanyahu to meet and sign a peace agreement. Obviously, tensions would remain high for the rest of the decade, poised to boil over in the year 2000. Lastly, in Israel, a bustling drug trade emerged, with Israelis becoming central figures in prominent ecstasy trafficking rings in the US. at the end of the 90s. Said the U.S. Customs Department, Israeli organized crime elements appear to be in control of the multi-billion-dollar U.S. ecstasy trade, from production through the international smuggling phase. The world didn't know it at the time, but Israel had a brewing organized crime problem. In Iraq in January 1995, CIA agent Robert Blair plotted with an Iraqi general to assassinate leader Saddam Hussein, but ultimately backed out when Iraq's military was placed on full alert during the ongoing Kurdish civil war. At the time, Iraq's finances were falling apart from economic sanctions. In October 1995, Saddam Hussein held a sham election in which he ran unopposed. The referendum question: do you agree that Saddam Hussein should be president of Iraq? With a 99.47% voter turnout, 99.6% of Iraqis voted yes. Iraq's gross domestic product was just $1 billion in the mid-90s, compared to $44.36 billion when the decade began. Middle-class Iraqis who had lived comfortably before Saddam invaded Kuwait and triggered the Gulf War were suddenly penniless and starving. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 children were dying a month from squalid conditions and a lack of resources worsened by the UN sanctions. With its influence over the United Nations, America didn't want to lift sanctions until Hussein was out of power, regardless of whether or not he complied with weapons inspections. Madeleine Albright summed up the US's policy in a 1996 60 Minutes interview.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it. It is a moral question, but the moral question is even a larger one. Don't we owe to the American people and to the American military and to the other countries in the region that this man not be a threat?
She didn't even deny the 500,000 number, which has been disputed to be lower. While the 500,000 statistic may not have been accurate, the situation was dire, and Albright's callousness spoke volumes. As conditions continued to deteriorate, the UN authorized the Oil for Food program, which allowed Iraq to sell oil on the world market in exchange for food and medicine, but not money. Reported the Palm Beach Post, Iraq must accept stringent UN monitoring to ensure that the money is not used to buy weapons, luxury goods, or other items of benefit to Hussein's regime. There was concern that Hussein hoarded the supplies to maintain control over the population. The program would be embroiled in corruption and controversy in the next decade. On August 31st, 1996, 30,000 through 40,000 Iraqi troops invaded the Kurdish city of Erbil, worsening allegations of impending genocide. In response, the US and the UK launched Operation Desert Strike on September 3, 1996, in which the Navy and Air Force targeted Iraq military bases. This didn't stop Iraq from helping install its favored Kurdish faction, the Kurdish Democratic Party, to power before retreating. Their opposition, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, weren't happy, and the fighting would continue, even drawing Turkey into the conflict. Eventually, the Kurdish groups made peace in September 1998 through a U.S. mediation, agreeing to share power and resources and deny Kurdish leftists and Iraqi troops from entering northern Iraq in exchange for military protection from Saddam. Iraq's international standing continued to stall as Saddam blocked weapons inspections by the United Nations in what was known as the Iraqi disarmament crisis. In September 1997, United Nations Special Commission Inspector Diane Seaman allegedly caught Iraqi men sneaking out of an inspection site with information about the creation of prohibited bacteria and chemicals. Saddam Hussein blocked more weapons inspections by the UN in the months to follow, and in August 1998, at a town hall meeting held on Ohio State's campus, Madeleine Albright sat down with Secretary of Defense William Cohen and National Security Advisor Sandy Berger to discuss the ongoing disarmament crisis. There remains a critical gap between the number of weapons we know Iraq produced and the amount we can confirm were destroyed, Albright claimed in the discussion for 5,000 students, which was broadcast on CNN. The town hall was damaged by booing protesters and interruptions of 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your racist war. While the trio of leaders claimed that Hussein was a dangerous blight to Americans and his own people, Cohen also insisted that What we are seeking to do is not to topple Saddam Hussein, not to destroy his country, but to do what the United Nations has said in its declarations. The protest showed a significant group of American youth did not want the country to play worldwide enforcer. On Halloween 1998, Clinton signed the Iraq Liberation Act to help Iraqi dissidents, including those previously warring Kurdish factions, to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Hussein wasn't just an American target, but he was also unpopular with Shiite Muslims, Kurds, the Iraqi National Congress, and Iran-based Shia groups. The Iraq Liberation Act was only rejected by 38 members of the House of Representatives and no members of the Senate. The same day as the signing, Iraq said it would no longer be allowing UN weapons inspections and kicked out all UN SCOM personnel in November. This prompted a 4-day blitz by the US and UK named Operation Desert Fox in December that further destabilized the region. Over 1,000 Iraqi soldiers and 100 civilians were killed. Tony Blair, who had been warned by his advisors that the attack wasn't lawful but desperately wanted to maintain US-UK relations, was criticized by British people. And Clinton was accused of trying to deflect from the ongoing Monica Lewinsky affair. Conditions worsened in Iraq in 1999 during a 2-month uprising of Shia Muslims. As sanctions continued, asked David Chirac in 1999, what poses the greater danger to the West's vital regional interests in the future? The survival of Saddam Hussein, or a generation of Iraqis made bitter by the indifference of Western nations which are running daily raids and self-defense? Asked an Iraqi civil engineer reduced to selling black market cigarettes on the street, do they really want to get rid of Hussein by killing all of us first? Perhaps they are actually helping to keep him in power. The last time we discussed Iran in the late 80s, the influence of Supreme Leader Ruhollah Khomeini meant a return of restrictive and fundamentalist Iranian culture that continued under his successor, Ali Khamenei. In 1996, Khomeini issued a fatwa declaring that the promotion of music is contrary to the goals and teachings of Islam. Music schools and public music lessons grinded to a halt. In 1998, Khomeini retracted the fatwa against Salman Rushdie for the controversial and best-selling The Satanic Verses. And in 1999, Khomeini issued a fatwa approving third-party donors in in vitro fertilization, paving the way for Iran to be the IVF capital of the Middle East and changing attitudes about infertility. In 1997, 80% of Iran's voters turned out for the elections, and 70% elected reformist candidate Mohammad Khatami president, a position with no control over the military, police, state communications, or prison. Khatami was popular with business leaders who wanted to open up Irani trade, leftists, college students and young voters, and those concerned with women's rights. Under President Akbar Rafsanjani from 1989 to 1997, women had seen increased rights, like the ability to initiate divorce and new employment opportunities, though they were disqualified from running for president, with Azam Talakhani becoming the first to attempt to get her name on the ballot in 1997. Mohammad Khatami became the first Iranian president to travel to 7 different European countries and also played a key role in diffusing violence. When 11 Iranian diplomats were killed in the Mazar-e-Sharif massacre in Afghanistan, Supreme Leader Khomeini demanded that Iranian troops invade to free the remaining hostages. President Khatami avoided war by stopping the plan and getting the hostages released through negotiation. However, most of Khatami's most progressive proposals were vetoed by the Guardian Council, a 12-member squad hand-selected by the Supreme Leader to uphold conservative Islamic values. On July 9, 1999, peaceful student protests at Tehran University began when the reformist newspaper Salam was shuttered. Undercover members of the Iranian volunteer militia forces started attacking the students as uniformed police watched. There was 1 confirmed death and a possible 17 more, with 300 protesters wounded. 5 days of protests followed, with militia members reportedly dressed as students and destroying property. 5 confirmed students and up to 65 more were disappeared. A neutered and defanged President Khatami disavowed the protesters, and restrictive rules about what Iranian citizens could publicly say about their country followed. and the rights of women would further be in jeopardy by the end of Khatami's presidency. Islamic practices, like the rest of the world's religions, were stratified by local customs, histories, politics, and beliefs. But violence against Muslims persisted. And if anybody was keeping score of the violence occurring against Muslims in Palestine, Chechnya, Kosovo, and elsewhere, it was Osama bin Laden. He and Al-Qaeda have long ideologically justified the killing of innocent civilians, no different in their mind than a nation striking, say, a TV station. In 1995, Osama was based in Sudan, investing in agriculture and infrastructure and helping to fund various Islamic insurgencies, even fostering ties with the group called the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. In 1995, they attempted to assassinate the Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak, an anti-Islamic fundamentalist with close relations to Israel. The EIJ was promptly kicked out of Sudan, who also wanted to offload Osama to Saudi Arabia for pardon, but Saudi Arabia refused to grant a pardon. Osama pissed off the Saudi royal family by criticizing them for allowing Western forces into Holy Land during the Gulf War. No longer welcome in Sudan, Osama chose to go to Jalalabad, Afghanistan with millions of dollars and approximately 300 followers in tow. The CIA had a unit dedicated to Osama by January 1996. And for the next 5 years, Al-Qaeda was an independent state within Afghanistan. In May 1996, Scott McLeod traveled to Afghanistan to meet with Osama for Time magazine. Writing, "Tall, barefoot, smiling broadly, bin Laden greeted me in a gold-trimmed robe and red-checkered headdress. With an exaggerated gesture of his arms, he offered a cushion as a seat." Depending on who is to be believed, this gracious hospitality came from either a devout Muslim businessman, as bin Laden would claim, or one of the most significant financial sponsors of Islamic extremist activities in the world today, as the U.S. State Department describes him. In an August 1996 fatwa, Osama mourned the loss of Muslim life at the hands of Western governments, saying, "Their blood was spilled in Palestine and Iraq. The horrifying pictures of the massacre of Qana in Lebanon are still fresh in our memory." He'd reissue the fatwa in February 1998 during an infamous interview with John Miller, who had been escorted to Osama's camp after inquiring around London and Pakistan and had no interpreter for what was being said at the time. He said, "We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms and civilians. They are all targets in this fatwa. American history does not distinguish between civilians and military, not even women and children. They are the ones who use bombs against Nagasaki. Can these bombs distinguish between infants and military? America does not have a religion that will prevent it from destroying all people. So we tell the Americans as people, and we tell the mothers of soldiers and American mothers in general, that if they value their lives and the lives of their children, to find a nationalistic government that will look after their interests and not the interests of the Jews." So Osama bin Laden had drawn a line in the sand. Western troops and people needed to leave the Middle East. The U.S. and other powers should stop allowing Israel to oppress and steal land from Palestinians, and sanctions and bombs needed to stop falling down. Of course, none of this happened. Aside from Al-Qaeda, it was a dangerous time to be in Afghanistan, where the Taliban faced constant threats to its growing power. It had captured Kabul on September 27, 1996, and established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Taliban's allies at the time were Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The United Nations and the United States refused to acknowledge the government and impose strict sanctions. So, with a limited economy, the Taliban continued to make use of Afghani poppy fields, earning a significant chunk of money from drug trafficking. Said an elderly farmer in 1997 who made $1,300 a year, "We cannot be more grateful to the Taliban. The Taliban have brought us security so we can grow our poppy in peace. I need to grow poppy crop to support my 14 family members." Shortly after the new government formed, two groups of enemies in the ongoing post-Soviet fallout formed the United Front Northern Alliance, sponsored by Iran, to destroy the Taliban. In reprisal, the Taliban would carry out at least 15 massacres over the next 5 years, including genocides of Shia Hazara and Mazar-e-Sharif in 1998. In a regime of atrocities, one of the only good things the Taliban did was in the practice of pederasty called bacha bazi, or dancing boys. Everything else, abysmal, most notably in the Taliban's treatment of women. Just 3 days after coming to power, Afghani women were banned from work and from leaving home without a male family member. Complained one woman to the Physicians for Human Rights in 1998, "I can't see a male doctor since I don't have a chaperone to accompany me. My brother is too young and my father is ill. I have no other male chaperone to accompany me to the doctor's office." When outside of the home, women were forced to wear burqas, an expensive and uncommon outfit that forced poor women to stay inside or face draconian punishment. Said one woman to the PHR, "My activities are restricted. Walking with the burqa is difficult. It has so many health hazards. You can't see well and there's a risk of falling or getting hit by a car. Also, for women with asthma or hypertension, wearing a burqa is very unhealthy." A doctor informed PHR that the garment may cause eye problems and poor vision, poor hearing, skin rash, headaches, increased cardiac problems and asthma, itching of the scalp, alopecia, and depression. While Afghani men were beaten for not having long enough beards, women were painstakingly erased from public life. They were banned from photos, the word women was banned in public titles, and they were banned from bikes, motorcycles, and balconies. Due to women being banned from work, Afghanistan immediately had a teaching shortage, and the only career left for women was being a doctor, as women weren't allowed male doctors. Kabul had 30,000 widows alone, and just roughly 50 women working the hospital to care for them and others. Reported Physicians for Human Rights, women who had once been teachers and nurses now move in the streets like ghosts under their enveloping burqas, selling every possession and begging so as to feed their children. Speaking of children, Afghani girls stopped being educated after 8 years old. For those with enough fortune, clandestine schools operated in the shadows. Women unlucky enough to not have male chaperones were routinely harassed, assaulted, and trafficked. Says a leader of Freedom Messengers, a Kabul women's rights group. If you ask about the missing, they'll say, "Our daughter's dead," or that she's off married in Pakistan. Many of the women probably did end up in Pakistan, but were sold to brothels or kept as virtual slaves inside homes, say officials from relief agencies. None have come back. Even if they could escape, these women would probably calculate that their families would no longer welcome them. This was the Afghanistan that Osama bin Laden operated from, binding Islam in the public eye to the intolerance of the Taliban and the violence of Al-Qaeda. On August 7th, 1998, 220 people were killed at U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in simultaneous truck bombings by Al-Qaeda operatives. This brought Osama and Al-Qaeda to broader American attention. Though the embassy attacks were one of several carried out by the group in the late 90s, it was the first direct attack on American citizens. Madeleine Albright's office had ignored the pleas of an ambassador named Prudence Bushnell to provide more security just 3 months before the bombings. Since Bushnell's arrival to Tanzania in 1996, she had warned the State Department that the lack of adequate security was endangering the lives of embassy personnel. The CIA had also told the State Department that there was an active terrorist cell in Kenya connected to Osama, generating at least 3 investigations into Nairobi-based terrorists in the year before the attack. The CIA also reported to Clinton that Al-Qaeda was training to attack America and hijack planes. And in fact, by November, core members of Al-Qaeda moved into an apartment in Hamburg, Germany, to strategize ways to punish America and Israel. They began creating plans and moving to America. In response to the embassy bombings, Clinton kicked off Operation Infinite Reach, a campaign of cruise missile attacks on Sudan and Afghanistan in August 1998. The main target was the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory, which supplied half of Sudan's medicine and the US wrongly believed was linked to bin Laden. The Taliban, which had briefly considered deporting Osama bin Laden, changed their mind after the missile attacks. 5 days later, a Planet Hollywood in Cape Town, South Africa was bombed in further retaliation. Bin Laden's survival of Operation Infinite Reach bolstered his reputation and made him a symbol of resistance to American tyranny, with support in pockets of the Middle East. Said a Pakistani rallying behind Osama in 1999, "For each of us killed or wounded, at least 100 Americans will be killed. I may not be alive, but you will remember my words." Reported the Washington Post, Audio tapes of Osama's speeches, translated from Arabic into Pakistani languages, have been circulated to mosques in major Pakistani cities. "Long Live Osama" has been painted on hundreds of cargo trucks since October, and Islamic seminaries operated by radical Sunni Muslim groups have displayed large portraits of bin Laden. Of course, this generalization of all Muslims as supporters of Osama would make it easier for the further dehumanization of Muslims when the crisis inevitably escalated. In America, the FBI placed Osama on the 10 most wanted list, and Al-Qaeda was designated a terrorist organization. New recruits lined up to join the cause. In 1999, the CIA and Pakistan struck a deal to sneak into Afghanistan and kill Osama. But when Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was overthrown in a coup, the new leader refused to go forward with the plan. On Halloween 1999, the crash of Egypt Air Flight 990 reportedly inspired Osama to craft an event that would change the course of American history. Additionally, several members of Al-Qaeda attempted to carry out high-profile bombings on January 1st, 2000, including Ahmed Rassam, an Algerian member who was caught with explosives in November. His intended target, had he not been caught and detained, Los Angeles International Airport. Oh my God, we really made it to Africa. Are you still here? Are you still watching this video? Do me a favor. I need you to go like, comment, make sure you're subscribed. I really hope you're enjoying Lexual Does the 90s. Now back to the history. While Middle Eastern countries clashed and were divided ideologically, Muammar Gaddafi, who issued an Interpol-approved arrest warrant for Osama bin Laden in 1998, was down in Libya like, so you guys don't care about pan-Arabism? Bet. He said, "I have no more to lose talking with Arabs. The Arab world is finished. Africa is a paradise. I would like Libya to become a black country. Hence, I recommend to Libyan men to marry only black women and to Libyan women to marry black men." Gaddafi shifted from pan-Arabism to pan-Africanism, earning a newfound glory amidst some radical black circles. This was evident in 1996 when he attempted to gift a reported $1 billion to the Nation of Islam, saying, "Our confrontation with America used to be like confronting a fortress from outside. Today, we have found an opening to enter the fortress and to confront it from within." At the time, Louis Farrakhan was visiting Libya to receive Gaddafi's self-named Human Rights Award, and Farrakhan said he'd use the money for voting registration, charity, and developing black businesses. But since 1986, all financial transfers between Libya and the US were banned when diplomatic ties were severed. Farrakhan would face imprisonment if he somehow accepted that money. Congressman Peter King requested that the Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, revoke Farrakhan's passport, and when the Nation of Islam leader returned from his trip, he was briefly investigated for also visiting Iraq, Iran, and Sudan. So Gaddafi also expanded diplomacy with other African nations. Amidst ongoing sanctions, Nelson Mandela visited with Gaddafi in 1997 and awarded him the Order of Good Hope in South Africa for helping end apartheid. In June 1998, one of Gaddafi's Amazonian guards was killed in an ambush by terrorists when she allegedly threw her body over his to save his life. Thanks in part due to mediation by Nelson Mandela, the sanctions against Libya were suspended in April 1999 when Gaddafi permitted suspects in the 1988 Pan Am Lockerbie bombing to be extradited for trial. Elsewhere in Africa, the Somali and Algerian civil wars continued, but let's zero in on Liberia.
Every minute in Liberia, we have somebody like this dying. Every minute. We are living in a complete nightmare. There's no law and order. The people just come and do what they want to do and take away and take lives away, properties whatsoever. So we are just left at the mercy of God.
The Liberian Civil War ended in 1996 with a requirement to hold a fair election the following year. Warlord Charles Taylor ran with the slogan, "He killed my ma, he killed my pa, but I will vote for him." Over 200,000 people had died during the Civil War, and many Liberians desired peace, believing that Taylor would turn violent if he wasn't elected. Wrote Kenneth Y. Best in a 1997 article titled, "What Were Liberians Thinking?" The people voted for Taylor out of the fear that if he did not win, he would return to the bush and resume the war. They knew that Taylor, having controlled, exploited, and sold the nation's primary resources over many years, gold, diamonds, iron ore, timber, rubber, coffee, and cocoa, had no shortage of cash, an advantage that helped him win so big. They also knew that Taylor, more than any other candidate, had some powerful international friends with lots of ready cash and arms, among them Libya, where Taylor's initial forces got their training and backing, the government of Taiwan, which Taylor persuaded the Liberian Council of State to recognize, and mining executives in South Africa, with whom, according to unconfirmed reports, he is said to have made some pre-election deals. 89% of Liberians voted, and Taylor won 75% of that vote in an election overseen by the UN. Jimmy Carter was also on hand.
But we've helped monitor about 20 elections in Africa and Latin America and so forth. I never have seen this many people turn out this early in the morning prepared to cast a balance.
Taylor's runner-up, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, self-exiled herself to avoid violence and reprisals, but wouldn't be done with Liberian politics. And randomly, she's also the aunt of the actress Retta. In 1997, Naomi Campbell met Charles Taylor at a South African charity dinner, where he gifted her with a small bag of uncut diamonds. During Taylor's rule, he'd trade diamonds for weapons with rebels in Sierra Leone, whose civil war had begun in 1991 and wouldn't end until 2002. Taylor attempted to assassinate one of his last significant opponents in 1998, a warlord named Roosevelt Johnson, living with a small but loyal militia in Monrovia. To be clear, every warlord in the Liberian Civil War had done their share of atrocities, but Johnson was associated with Joshua Bly, or General Butt Naked, a commander of child soldiers who made them fight naked or in women's clothes to protect them from bullets, sacrifice children, take drugs, and commit acts of cannibalism. He converted to Christianity in 1996 when the war was over and moved to Ghana to minister to Liberian refugees. He estimated that he was responsible for the deaths of approximately 20,000 people, 500 to 600 by his own hand, and he's still walking around free to this day. But let's move on before this turns into a rant. While Charles Taylor's secret police attempted to kill Roosevelt Johnson, he fled to the US Embassy, where a fight ensued. Taylor's men failed to get Johnson, who left for Ghana, and instead murdered hundreds of people from the Kron ethnic group, whose most famous member was the assassinated former Liberian president, Samuel Doe. This caused several rebellions. Dissident Liberians, called the Organization of Displaced Liberians, invaded Liberia from Guinea with Guinea and Sierra Leone forces. They had support from the UK and the US in their goal to force Charles Taylor from office. Another anti-Taylor rebellion group popped up, triggering the Second Liberian Civil War. A conservative Muslim, he cemented his power in rigged elections and worked to suppress women's rights by denying birth control and implementing a dress code. He accepted an IMF loan, but foreign debt grew to $1.4 billion, leading to a strike by public employees and teachers. His reign was extremely short, as he was killed by his own guards in 1999. A similar fate awaited the leader of Niger's southern neighbor. Since coming to power in 1993, General Sani Abacha reduced Nigeria's foreign debt by $9 billion, installed new roads to important cities, and worked to stabilize oil exports. Nigeria was also organized into 6 zones with 6 additional states for a total of 36. Along the way, Sani embezzled billions and was elusive about holding elections. In 1995, environmental activist and writer Ken Beeson Saro-Wiwa from Ogoniland was executed along with 8 others despite international outrage. Their phony convictions for murdering 4 Ogoni chiefs was payback for protesting the Royal Dutch Shell Oil Company since the early 80s. The executions brought international backlash, though Louis Farrakhan still visited in the midst of the controversy during his ongoing World Friendship Tour.
I said yesterday that I thought this was a fraudulent trial, a bad verdict, an unjust sentence, and it has now been followed by judicial murder. I don't think that is acceptable. I see no way in which it can be defended. And if the Harare principles mean anything, I do not myself see how Nigeria can stay in the Commonwealth until they return to democratic government.
We have done everything in our power as friends and as brothers to assist. But apparently they are inexorably set on a course of self-destruction.
You're not no leader of Nigeria. You got no right to murder anybody.
The last message we want to send to Abacha is this: you have already lost. There is no way in which your evil and injustice and oppression can prevail forever. Join the winning side. Join the side that seeks to establish democracy.
Ongoing oppressive conditions and lack of opportunity and resources saw thousands of Nigerians leaving the country for the UK, the US, France, and elsewhere. Nelson Mandela called for a Nigerian oil boycott and pressured the Commonwealth of Nations to drop the country, ultimately getting the nation suspended with the threat of expulsion if it did not achieve democracy within 2 years. In 1996, the same year that the Nigerian Super Eagles traveled to Atlanta and became the first African nation to win Olympic gold in soccer, Nigeria was experiencing a meningitis epidemic that killed approximately 15,000 people of roughly 110,000 infected. Enter the pharmaceutical company Pfizer, who ran tests for their new antibiotic, Trovon, on 200 children ages 3 months to 18 years old in Kano, a majority Muslim city. Benefiting from a cash-strapped and disorganized military dictatorship and seeking $1 billion in profits a year, Pfizer set up its testing sites near Doctors Without Borders locations to confuse people seeking care and did not obtain informed consent from parents for their testing. Said a physician, "I could not protest. The system you have in America and the system we have here, there's a wide gap. Freedom of speech is still not here." 11 children died within a month of Pfizer's trials, and others suffered from disabilities like blindness or deafness. Clinical drug trials by American companies were increasingly happening overseas, where ethics and/or consent were not priorities. Revelations about Pfizer's treatment of Nigerian and Muslim children in Kano didn't become public until 2000, which we'll discuss the broader impact of intellectual does the 2000s. In February 1998, the Nigerian-led Economic Community of Western African States Monitoring Group, or ECOMOG, overthrew the Nubile military junta in Sierra Leone, whose ongoing civil war since 1991 continued to wreak instability when ECOMOG withdrew in September 1999. The democratically elected president Ahmad Kaba, who the junta had overthrown in 1997, was reinstalled president. The United Nations began sending peacekeepers to Sierra Leone in December 1999, but fighting continued for 3 years. As for Nigeria's Sani Abacha, on June 8, 1998, he died suddenly, with most historians agreeing it was poison. Said the director of Amnesty International's advocacy program for Africa, Abacha's death could be an opportunity to salvage the country's political future, or it could lead to a near certain dead end with a significant chance of real violence. Mashoud Abiola, Abacha's one-time opponent who had been jailed since declaring himself president in 1994, died just a month after Abacha from a heart attack, though rumors briefly persisted that he had been poisoned by American diplomat Susan Rice. One of Abacha's political enemies, a former head of state named Olusegun Obasanjo, had been in prison for treason since 1995. He was released when Abacha died. During his imprisonment, he had cultivated a foreign support system in Mandela, the Pope, and intellectuals. He became a born-again Christian and was elected president through the People's Democratic Party, kicking off the Fourth Nigerian Republic. Under Olusegun Obasanjo, who dismissed 200 military officers and stoked religious tension, there was more freedom of press and criticism of government. In the aftermath of the genocide in Rwanda, Mobutu Sese Seko opened the country of Zaire to the Hutus and permitted them to establish bases, which they did in the eastern region close to Rwandan borders. At the time, Zaire was in serious decline after US support dried up after the Cold War, and Mobutu was in failing health. The Hutus, from their ideal positions across the Rwandan-Zaire border, launched attacks and began killing Zaire's Tutsi, the people called Banyamulenge. Rwanda's Paul Kagame, with support from Uganda's Yoweri Museveni, sent the Banyamulenge weapons. Mobutu then expelled the Banyamulenge under the threat of death in November 1996. The next next month, Museveni and Kagame helped the opposition, led by Laurent Desire Kabila, attack Zaire's armed forces. Mobutu was in Europe receiving cancer treatment at the time and couldn't help organize a proper defense. Zaire's troops folded with little resistance, and on May 23, 1997, Zaire became the Democratic Republic of the Congo, after peace talks mediated by Nelson Mandela. Laurent Desire Kabila installed himself as president, with his inauguration attended by the leaders of Angola, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia. In less than 3 months, Kabila was extremely unpopular. Asked a poll in 1997, in the presidential elections, which candidate would you vote for? Kabila received just 11%. The problem? Kabila continued his predecessor's reign of corruption, yet failed to court a cult of personality. Additionally, Ugandan and Rwandan forces refused to leave the Congo, undermining his power. And while the international community fielded reports of war crimes by the Rwandan government against Hutus in the DRC in 1996 and 1997, newbie President Kabila did not want to be associated with such allegations. So Rwanda and Uganda secretly began backing Kabila's opposition, while Kabila found new allies in Namibia, Angola, and Zimbabwe. On July 27, 1998, Kabila ordered Rwandan and Ugandan forces out of the DRC, and they were promptly escorted and flown out, making the Banyamulenge pissed and nervous. Their militias collaborated with Rwandan and Ugandan soldiers to become the Rally for Congolese Democracy, and started attacking the Congolese capital on August 4, 1998 in Operation Katona. The RCD was initially overwhelming for the Congo's military, but allied forces from Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Chad, Libya, and Sudan helped beat them back. Uganda also created its own exclusive rebel force, the Movement for the Liberation of Congo, further adding fuel to the chaos. In 1999, Uganda's Museveni and Congo's Kabila signed a ceasefire, but the RCD and Rwanda's Kagame refused to sign. And this wasn't the only fracture. Different loyalties were springing up among the RCD. When the Lusaka ceasefire agreement was signed in July 1999, it didn't take long before fighting began again. The Second Congo War would continue into the 21st century, involving thousands of child soldiers, widespread rape, deforestation, displacement of civilians that led to survival hunting of elephants and gorillas and other bushmeats, and 2 to 5 million people dead. While Rwanda was intervening in the Congo, trouble brewed at home. Rwanda's government was a fragile marionette in which Kagame led foreign affairs, military, and security, as the Hutu president, Pastor Bizimungu, served in a symbolic capacity. The important coffee industry lay in near ruins too. Before the genocide, it had been 60% of the nation's total exports, and this would just be 20% at the end of the decade. Kagame sought economic advice from China, Singapore, and Thailand, and 40% of Rwanda's population was dead or had fled into other territories. Genocide trials by the Rwandan government began on August 30th, 1996, leading to 22 public executions by firing squad 2 years later. The United Nations held trials of prominent Rwandan government officials and military members beginning in 1997, ultimately convicting 61 people out of 93 total indicted. Kagame's own reputation was shady, and he was believed to have greenlit massacres of Hutus in 1997 and the assassinations of opposers, like his former interior minister in 1998. That same year, during his highly publicized trip to Africa just months after the Monica Lewinsky affair, Bill Clinton stopped in Rwanda and admitted to denying the genocide.
He did not act quickly enough after the killing began. We should not have allowed the refugee camps to become safe haven for the killers. We did not immediately call these crimes by their rightful name, genocide.
And In Uganda in 1995, the Lord's Resistance Army kidnapped children from Adiak Amaru district to turn them into sex slaves and soldiers. They also killed 200 to 300 villagers. More kidnappings followed, including taking 139 girls from St. Mary's College Secondary School in Mbeki the following year. The LRA was partly funded by Sudan in retaliation for Uganda supporting the rebels in the ongoing Second Sudanese Civil War. After a brief pause in operations in 1996, when the LRA wrongly believed Yoweri would be ousted in that year's elections, they continued their campaign of violence in the late 90s under Joseph Kony. But Yoweri wasn't going anywhere. In 1997, the same year he announced universal public education, Yoweri was described by the New York Times thusly: he maintains that most African nations are not ready for a multi-party democracy on a Western model. Such democracies, he says, need a thriving economy and a middle class that can form parties around issues other than ethnicity. In his words, multi-party democracy will come, but it will come when the society has got a social base for it. The problem here is you are talking about a multi-party democracy in a pre-industrial society. The society must be transformed. We don't have a middle class. Bill Clinton was the first sitting American president to visit Uganda. During his tour, he made headlines for nearly apologizing for slavery, which his political advisors feared would be too controversial and generate calls for reparations. In Kampala, Clinton held a newborn, whose mother proceeded to name him Bill Clinton Kalagani. While touring Uganda's schools, Bill promised $120 million in aid to further African education, especially for girls. Down in Zimbabwe in 1996, Robert Mugabe was re-elected president. The 72-year-old also got married to his 7-year-long mistress, Gracie, whose luxurious lifestyle earned her the nickname Gucci Grace. 40,000 people attended their wedding ceremony, including 2 of the couple's children and Nelson Mandela. The next year, Mugabe pushed the British government to pay compensation to white commercial farmers who would lose their property during accelerated land reform. If Mugabe thought the newly empowered Labour Party would be on his side, he was sorely mistaken. Said United Kingdom Secretary of State Claire Short, "We are a new government from diverse backgrounds without links to former colonial interests. My own origins are Irish, and as you know, we were colonized, not colonizers." This soured relations between the UK and Zimbabwe. Mugabe's land reform plans would be stalled in 1998 when the IMF threatened to withhold funds if Zimbabwe didn't reduce its number of farm confiscations from 841 to 118. Within 2 years of Mugabe's re-election, Zimbabwe's economy plunged when the administration was forced to pay the $4.2 billion in pensions to fighters who participated in the revolution back in 1980. When Mugabe proposed higher taxes to pay for the pensions, there was a general strike by union leaders in opposition from the ZANU-PF. There were numerous strikes during this period, and the National Constitution Assembly, a group of trade unions, individual citizens, and civic organizations, was founded in 1997 to pressure reform in Zimbabwe. Nations across the world were feeling the effects of the Asian financial crisis at this time. But worsening Zimbabwe's finances was Mugabe sending 11,000 troops to the Congo to assist Laurent Desire Kabila. Mugabe did so without deliberating with Parliament, costing an estimated $1 million a day. When the IMF demanded to know where the money was coming from, Mugabe claimed that foreign friends were footing the bill. A poll found 70% of Zimbabweans were opposed to participating in the Congo War. In January of 1998, the Harare food riots led to looting, 10 people killed and hundreds hurt. In the aftermath, the army went around searching homes for stolen food, and Mugabe instituted price controls on basic staples. The government blamed the financial crisis on the 1% of the 10 million Zimbabweans who were white, with the information minister claiming white farmers and industrialists are funding the disruption. Increasingly, Mugabe relied on a strategy of blaming white Zimbabweans, who did control disproportionate amounts of agriculture, manufacturing, and mining, and gay people for the country's worsening problems. In August 1995, when a book fair came under fire for including a display about HIV prevention by the mostly white Gay and Lesbian Association of Zimbabwe, Mugabe railed against gay rights activists, saying, "Is the book fair based on sodomy? What moral fiber shall our society ever have to deny organized drug addicts, or even those given to bestiality, the rights they might claim under the rubrics of individual freedom and human rights?" When Mugabe visited South Africa shortly after the book fair incident, he was jeered by hundreds of protesters and gay activists who felt compelled to speak out on behalf of homosexuals in neighboring Zimbabwe, who didn't have the same legal protections and access to the media. In September 1995, Mugabe's parliament banned gay sex. His predecessor, Canaan Banana, was accused of being gay and publicly tried and convicted for 11 counts of sodomy. Banana ran to South Africa when on bail, and Nelson Mandela convinced him to return to Zimbabwe, where he served 6 months in prison. This strategic homophobia was happening elsewhere in Africa too. For instance, said an official in Namibia in October 1996, homosexuality is like cancer or AIDS and everything should be done to stop its spread. Ongoing homophobia on the continent would delay larger organization against HIV/AIDS, which continued to wreck the population. Out of 600 million Africans, 22.5 million were infected. The World Health Organization found that HIV/AIDS was the leading cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa after 1998, cutting life expectancy by a quarter. Reported Dorothy Logie in 1999, in only 2 countries, Uganda and Senegal, does the epidemic seem to be abating. Strong governmental leadership in these countries ensures that there is universal health education, that condoms are easily available, and that there is coordinated action from the government. So the devastation of the deadly AIDS virus played out in the background of dissatisfaction with Mugabe. In March 1998, a 2-day general strike led to accusations by Mugabe that the 1 million members of the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions was colluding with whites to destroy his regime. Militia members loyal to Mugabe threatened businesses that closed, and the strikes had little effect beyond feeding Mugabe's propaganda. In January 1999, 23 members of the Zimbabwe military were arrested for plotting a coup. 2 journalists who reported on the coup were arrested and tortured, resulting in the U.S. suspending a $120 million aid package. In December 1999, the IMF cut off Zimbabwe. In 1996, the Afrikaners National Party withdrew from South Africa's coalition government, leaving the African National Congress in majority control with a minority of the conservative Inkatha Freedom Party, made up mostly of Zulus. With Nelson Mandela as president and Thabo Mbeki as deputy president, race relations in the post-apartheid nation were precarious to say the least. For starters, the ANC's commitment to a rainbow nation would lead to charges of pandering to whites. These same whites tended to be upset whenever the term affirmative action was used, alleging that this would lead to white brain drain. When Mandela pushed black people to support the Springboks in the 1995 Rugby World Cup to bring the races together, the team had just 1 black player. The mostly white audience cheering Nelson after the nation's victory brought symbolic goodwill, but it didn't diffuse the racism. In Cape Town in 1995, armed Afrikaners got violent with police after threatening and taunting black students integrating a school in their neighborhood.
Sis, but we will kill you in this village.
Let's go home and go suck on my labor,
we will kill those people here in this village, man. We're hateful for your people.
This morning, I don't know if you witnessed it, I was insulted, pointed finger at me, banged on my car, and called me a kafir, and they told me that if I feel that by coming to this school I'm going to end up marrying a white woman, I must forget it.
But this did not sway extremists like the Afrikaner resistance movement, who bombed a grocery store in the Western Cape in 1996, killing 3 children, an adult, and injuring 60 others. The group's founder, Eugene Terreblanche, was arrested for beating a man named Paul Motshabi nearly to death in 1996. Also that year, in a small town 150 miles from Johannesburg, 700 white students at a primary school were made to stay home by their parents when classes were integrated with 16 black children.
Don't fear the black children. I mean, it's ridiculous to fear a few black children. We ask the government on principle. We want to maintain our Afrikaans culture, character, ethos, etc. Because we are a very small minority group in this province. and we were refused.
Reported the LA Times, about 20 white pupils defied the walkout, and 11-year-old Robin Garner stood in the entrance hall to warmly welcome the first blacks allowed to enroll since the school was built for white farmers' children 104 years ago.
It was fun. We don't mind about this. We don't mind about them coming in. It's normal. Every school has to have it. We don't mind it at all.
I'm feeling nice. We already got their friends, and they don't have problems. They also like to play with us, and we want to play with them.
And what did you do today?
We were playing hide and seek with them, and they don't have problems.
Said one black mother, they will go to another school, but we blacks are coming there. We're going to that school where they are taking their children. So where will they end up? In the sea? At the time, there were 1.8 million black students in this particular province who needed to be enrolled in school, with many forced to study outside. Prior to 1994, anyone who wasn't white was routinely boiled down to black for the sake of apartheid, though distinct racial groups existed. 60% of South African Indians supported white minority parties in the 1994 elections. Multiracial or colored South Africans also voted for white minorities, further straining race relations. In 1996, the ANC took a census to determine the country's racial demographics. 76.7% were black African, 10.9% were colored, 8.9% were white, and 2.6% were Asian or Indian. The following year, South Africa's Indian community was highlighted when Karishni Naker became the first woman of Indian ancestry to win Miss South Africa and represent the country in global pageants. In 1996, Mandela divorced his wife Winnie and met with Louis Farrakhan during his World Friendship Tour. Thabo Mbeki delivered a powerful speech on May 8th of that year called "I Am an African," rousing Pan-Africanism. He declared, "Whatever the setbacks of the moment, nothing can stop us now. Whatever the difficulties, Africa shall be at peace. However improbable it may sound to the skeptics, Africa will prosper." Mbeki was gearing up to be the next in charge. When Mandela stepped down as head of the ANC, Mbeki ran unopposed and was elected president in 1997. Jacob Zuma, a former apartheid political prisoner in Zulu, was elected deputy president, beating out his challenger, Winnie Mandela, who was accused that year of murdering a young activist in the 80s. Said Mandela in his final speech as ANC president, "One of the temptations of a leader who has been elected unopposed is that he may use his powerful position to settle scores with his detractors, to marginalize them, and in some cases get rid of them, and to surround himself with yes men and women. I know Mbeki understands these issues. He is not the kind of man to sideline anyone." Would this be the case? In December 1997, Parliament passed a bill that required companies that employed over 50 people to deliver affirmative action plans for women, blacks, and disabled people. By this time, dreams of the South African Rainbow Nation were being shed for more pragmatic action and conversations under Mbeki's growing influence. At a May 1998 Parliament debate, described historian Tula Simpson, he said South Africa consisted of a rich white nation and a poor black one, and reconciliation had to be between these nations rather than individual perpetrators and victims of all colors. 4 years were insufficient to create the material base for nation building and reconciliation. So Mbeki insisted that improving the lives of the poor was the biggest priority. Also in 1998, the same year that the ANC voted to approve a measure to procure weapons in defense for the newly sovereign nation, a 6-month-old black child named Angeline Zwane was strapped to her cousin's back when she was shot and killed by a white farmer. Her cousin, an 11-year-old named Francina, was shot too, but survived. The farmer, Nicholas Stein, claimed it was an accidental shooting and wasn't arrested for 3 days. He was supported by other white farmers who pointed to rising crime rates. But for decades, Angeline Zwane's family had been domestic servants living in shacks on the Stein property. Reported the Chicago Tribune, some witnesses said the shooter had a bottle of liquor in his hand and yelled a racial epithet for South African blacks. Nelson Mandela visited the grieving family to offer comfort and criticize the police. Upon questioning police about their investigation, he was incensed. "You mean you didn't search his house? How long have you been in the police force?" Mandela asked one officer. And Stein received a 3-year suspended jail sentence, pissing off black people.
It's every kid's dream come true, a birthday that lasts a whole year.
But then this is a pretty special birthday boy. President Mandela turns 80 on Saturday. And to launch the year-long celebration, a bash for the president and 1,000 foster children.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.
This is becoming something of a tradition. Since 1995, a year after he became president, Mandela has invited disadvantaged kids to celebrate his birthday with him.
In July, Mandela married his third wife, Graça Machel, the widow of the former president of Mozambique, on his 80th birthday. They told their children about the wedding an hour before. In the teeny landlocked independent enclave of South Africa called Lesotho, chaos broke out after their 1998 parliamentary elections. The South African military was deployed to intervene in September and restore order amidst looting and violence, causing some observers to believe that this was setting a dangerous precedent. In March 1999, Nelson Mandela announced he wouldn't seek a second term as South African president. He'd say, "I welcome the possibility of reveling in obscurity." Reported the BBC, sections of South Africa's black community have criticized Mandela for pandering to whites and for concentrating too much on foreign affairs rather than domestic problems like crime and job creation. The pandering hadn't been enough for racists. The Democratic Party, headed by Tony Leon, received massive support from whites when he vowed to fight back against the ANC party. He called affirmative action to uplift Native South Africans a new apartheid. The ANC, however, won in a landslide that year, with Thabo and Mbeki in charge and Jacob Zuma as deputy. Women were a major part of this victory, as they benefited from ANC policies. Reported Louise Vincent, more than 1 million more women than men registered to vote in South Africa's second democratic election in 1999. Since 1994, South African women's economic freedom rose from a score of 63.9 to 81.9. The election saw 29.8% of seats in the national legislature, or 119 out of 400, going to women, up from 27% in the previous parliament, and in stark contrast to the less than 3% of women parliamentarians prior to 1994. Thabo Mbeki reoriented the ANC towards neoliberal policies, away from the socialism outlined in the Freedom Charter, to the dismay of radical leftist South Africans. For instance, Mbeki believed that reducing public sector jobs in favor of privatization would better the economy. The country had lost over 500,000 jobs since 1994, due in part to falling gold prices and being impacted by the Asian financial crisis. Whites, while less than 10% of the population, still dominated industry and agriculture, controlling who was employed and at what prices. Poverty meant crime, and crime meant wealthy enclaves behind barbed wire, while the poor did the best they could. Racial solidarity was growing stratified by class, especially because there was a new, small, but increasingly wealthy black social class, growing leaps and bounds above the majority of poor black South Africans. Wrote historian Leonard Thompson on Mbeki's uphill challenge. Black cabinet ministers, members of parliament, judges, and members of the 9 provincial governments received salaries and prerequisites that raise them far above the masses and that are generous even by the standards of the United States and other industrialized countries. Black entrepreneurs benefit, sometimes unfairly, from affirmative action and political contacts, receiving lucrative contracts for public works. White companies and corporations often find it expedient to place blacks in senior positions, including on their boards. Many members of this new black political and business elite have adopted extravagant lifestyles. They live in rich suburbs, wear flashy clothing, drive top-of-the-line BMWs, and send their children to expensive private schools. Even while this new class of black people was growing, a lot of them still lived in shanty towns. In fact, the majority of them. The crime that plagued South Africa, plus the widening wealth gap, would barely improve under Mbeki. In 1996, 2 years after returning from exile, Jean-Bertrand Aristide left office and formally registered the Famille Lavalas as a political party in Haiti, in opposition to the newly elected René Préval. Aristide, a former Catholic priest, also got married, causing a little bit of dismay. As a result of structural adjustment, the small nation of Haiti was importing rice from America, damaging the economy and job market. With an unemployment rate of 75%, boys and men were joining gangs or selling drugs. Upon Préval's ascension, the Haiti Support Group reported that the country would be totally bankrupt in 2 months. In a February 1996 agreement with the World Bank, Préval sanctioned the privatization of the telephone and electricity systems, the flour mill, cement plant, the seaport, and the airport, and Port-au-Prince. Critics pointed out that while state services like electricity and telephones were mismanaged and inadequate, reform and modernization was the answer, not privatization. Protests and anti-privatization sentiment raged, forcing the prime minister to quit. As companies went unsold, the IMF and US aid paused $100 million in aid. Haiti's economy worsened as drug trafficking and crime grew. Aristide and the Famille Lavalas built power amidst rumors of collaborating with gangs and greenlighting violence. The murder of a police chief and one of Aristide's guards generated headlines and fears of another coup. Wrote the New Internationalist, Haiti's social extremes are glaringly visible and statistically shocking. It has more millionaires per head than any Latin American or Caribbean nation. An estimated 10,000 Haitians out of a population of 6.8 million live in an unabashed luxury. Yet this is also the poorest country in the Americas, with an annual income per person of around $250. In January 1999, Preval dissolved Congress and ruled by decree for the final year of his presidency. Complained Yves A. Isidore, the Haitians, collectively the poorest people in the Americas, continue to watch Aristide and Preval do nothing at all to improve their quality of life, but squabble for power. Drug trafficking, killings, gross human rights violations, and gross incompetence, to name only these ones, are on the rise. By the next election at the turn of the century, 11 political figures were murdered, 10 of them suspected to be tied to Famille Lavalas. On February 24, 1996, the Cuban Air Force shot down 2 planes operated by a Cuban government opposition group named Brothers to the Rescue, killing 4 people. A third plane escaped. Brothers to the Rescue had been warned to stop entering Cuban airspace to drop leaflets on the local populations. As such, Cuba viewed the incident as a sovereign act of defense of its borders, taken after a long history of provocative acts by that organization. The incident renewed anti-Castro fever among Cuban Americans. Said one high-ranking Miami official, "It's just one more outrage, one more act of despotism, and one more act of murder by Fidel Castro. Hopefully those in Washington who favor the soft line will open up their eyes." The Clinton administration pounced.
This shooting of civilian aircraft out of the air was a flagrant violation of international law. Today, I am also ordering the following unilateral actions. First, I am asking that Congress pass legislation that will provide immediate compensation to the families, something to which they are entitled under international law, out of Cuba's blocked assets here in the United States. Second, I will move promptly to reach agreement with the Congress on the pending Helms-Burton Cuba legislation so that it will enhance the effectiveness of the embargo in a way that advances the cause of democracy in Cuba.
The U.S.'s Helms-Burton Act added more punishments and risks for international companies trading with Cuba in transgression of the American embargo. U.S. citizens were now allowed to sue said companies if they used property stolen by the Cuban government. Cuba's economy managed to stay afloat despite these sanctions and began reversing its losses in 1995 thanks to austerity, tourism, and biotechnology, which became the primary earner over sugar. Gas restrictions continued the popularity of bikes, but rollerblading also came into fashion. In 1996, all of Cuba's 12,436 schools were open simultaneously for the first time in 5 years. Because of flourishing tourism, there was an attempt to undermine Cuba's success when an anti-communist exile and ex-CIA asset named Luis Posada Carrillas masterminded the Cuba hotel bombings in 1997, injuring 11 people and killing an Italian tourist. He had been funded by Jorge Mas Canosa and the Cuban American National Foundation, and benefited from a tolerant U.S. law enforcement. The attacks were carried out by Salvadoran mercenaries. In the new Cuba at the late 90s, life expectancy rose from 75 years to 75.6 years, but new dynamics like tourism and a rise in sex work. The hardships of the early 90s brought more religion and Castro's tolerance too. In 1997, Castro introduced new environmental laws to reduce the country's ecological footprint and rely on less fossil fuels. Squatters were also legally able to be evicted from Havana, impacting 1,600 people described as internal migrants not formally legally registered to live in the capital. In 1996, Times Books published the memoir Long Time Gone by William Lee Brent, a former Black Panther who hijacked a plane while out on bail in 1969, and he diverted it to Cuba, who allowed him to live as an exile. He said to the New York Times during the book's release, "Here I have basically learned that I was an American. I had never considered myself an American before, but you can't get rid of what you are, what you grew up in, the way you were formed." He said of Cuba's increasing ties to capitalism and weakening socialism, people have discovered that not all Cubans are in agreement with the revolution, that they want some things the revolution taught them were bad, like Big Macs and Nikes. Brent was one of dozens of American radicals living in exile in Cuba. The activist, accused cop murderer, former Catholic, and fugitive Assata Shakur had been living as a wanted woman on the island since 1984, after a politically motivated conviction in New Jersey. In January 1998, Pope John Paul II visited Cuba. The trip was important because Castro wanted to demonstrate his tolerance of religion, which he had previously discouraged. People celebrated the Pope's visit in the streets, and the Pope criticized capitalism, the United States, and its brutal embargo, saying they are always deplorable because they hurt the most needy. When he spoke before a crowd of at least 150,000 in Santiago de Cuba, he and a city archbishop suddenly threw shade at Castro and communism, though. He said, "There is also suffering of the soul, such as we see in those who are isolated, persecuted, imprisoned for various offenses or for reasons of conscience, for ideas which, though dissident, are nonetheless peaceful." For most of his 5-day trip, the Pope, with impunity, made critical remarks rumored to piss off top Cuban officials and some civilians who couldn't speak as freely. Said a writer for the Communist Party Daily, "There's an imbalance. The Pope criticizes the education system, and there was no response." While the Pope called for the release of Cuba's 600 estimated political prisoners, the New Jersey State Police sent a letter to the Pope requesting he demand Assata's extradition to the States. On Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, Assata penned her own open letter to the Pope. "I am not writing to ask you to intercede on my behalf. I ask nothing for myself. I only ask you to examine the social reality of the United States and to speak out against the human rights violations that are taking place." Of course, the entire letter and Castro's refusal to acquiesce to anybody's requests enraged New Jersey officials. 2 months later, in March 1998, Governor Christine Todd Whitman offered a $100,000 reward for anyone who brought Assata back and requested that Janet Reno pull some strings to get her extradited. In Florida, where Cuban politicians had built coalitions of power on their anti-communist, anti-Castro stances, one said, "This is normal behavior for Fidel Castro, to give safe haven to terrorists, to drug dealers, to cop killers." In September 1998, the same month 5 Cuban spies were arrested in Miami for espionage and other crimes, the U.S. State Department proposed that the embargo against Cuba would be lifted if Shakur and 90 other fugitives were extradited. Maxine Waters and other members of the Congressional Black Caucus voted for the measure because they didn't recognize Assata's birth name of Joanne Chesimard on the list of fugitives. Waters wrote a letter to Castro clarifying her position, saying of Assata's conviction, "This illegal, clandestine political persecution was wrong in 1973 and remains wrong today." On November 21st, 1999, an international incident would be triggered in the new millennium when 5-year-old Elian Gonzalez survived a shipwreck during an illicit escape from Cuba. His mother perished, but his father Juan was back in Cuba. When found by 2 fishermen and handed to the U.S. Coast Guard, he was sent to his uncle Lazaro in Miami. Under the 1995 wet feet, dry feet policy, an interpretation of the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act, in which Cubans intercepted at sea were sent back to Cuba or a third country, and those caught on land were allowed to pursue residency, the solution should have been simple. But when Elian's father demanded his return, a small dispute became a political powder keg in the year 2000. The devaluation of the Mexican peso occurred at the end of December 1994 and for the first 10 months of 95. U.S. exports to Mexico dropped while foreign investors fled. However, Mexican tourism bookings saw a 10 to 12% increase as vacationers took advantage of killer deals. New President Ernesto Zedillo announced that the government would be cutting spending, selling off assets, and making sure wages lagged behind inflation. On January 17, 17th, he signed an agreement with opposing politicians to maintain fair elections and keep foreign investors happy. As the Mexican economy stalled, observers predicted a huge wave of immigrants flooding into America. For some, Mexico's strife was a clear example of neoliberal policies gutting a nation. Since the 80s, state enterprises had been sold, labor had been weakened, and 23 billionaires had been created. The Clinton administration authorized a $20 billion loan to Mexico without congressional approval, ruffling more than a few feathers. Critics claimed Clinton's decision was simply a bailout of American companies in Mexico. Wrote Jorge Castaneda, American taxpayers cannot first be told that their country has just signed a free trade pact with a modern, dynamic, successful nation, and a few months later be informed that they must co-sign a credit of up to $40 billion to save that same nation from chaos. Others complained that the loan would destroy America. Cried Pat Buchanan, it was daylight robbery of the nation's wealth. It is money the American taxpayers will never see again. This turned out to be a dramatic lie, as Mexico only borrowed 60% of the $20 billion and paid it back 3 years ahead of schedule, including $500 million in interest. But, wrote David E. Sanger, while the administration was eager to describe Mexico today as a patient in recovery, the cost was high for Mexican workers who lost their jobs during the austerity program imposed as a condition of the loans, for homeowners who were unable to pay their mortgages, and for businesses that suddenly found themselves caught in a severe recession. Crime has soared in Mexico City. The pay of Mexican workers is still badly depressed, and the peso has stabilized, but failed to return to its earlier values. There was also an $18 billion trade deficit with Mexico. Yay, NAFTA! Zedillo continued to seek to better Mexico's global ties, like courting China, but the U.S. was its biggest apple. U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry was the first in the modern era to personally visit Mexico in 1995, leading to $50 million in arms and military training the following year. And U.S. presidents had skipped visiting Mexico since 1979 until Clinton's journey in '97. The two countries announced a joint strategy to fight drug and gun trafficking. Said Clinton, "We have less than 5% of the world's population and we consume about half the drugs. And we're more than happy every year, American citizens, to give billions of dollars that winds up in the hands of narco traffickers." A major part of the strategy was granting DEA agents the authority to be armed while in Mexico, generating concern. Zedillo assured critics that the alliance was based on absolute respect of sovereignty and territorial jurisdiction of Mexico and of the United States. Clinton, who began militarizing the border in '93 and '94, also swore to not carry out mass deportations of undocumented immigrants. Between 1999 and 2000, over 700,000 Mexicans arrived to the U.S., moving further from the border to places like Atlanta, Raleigh, Portland, and Seattle. Remember the EZLN, aka the Zapatistas, and the shaky peace established under the previous president? In February 1995, President Zedillo revealed the identity of the group's mass leader, Subcomandante Marcos, as a Marxist former professor named Rafael Vicente. The Mexican government issued arrest warrants, and the military was ordered to capture and destroy the Zapatistas. Hundreds of thousands of Mexicans held rallies in support of Marcos and the EZLN in Mexico City. When the military held a faction of the EZLN under siege, Zedillo went the diplomatic route. He and his cabinet recognized that the EZLN were a less brutal and more pacifist alternative to leftist groups that would emerge if Marcos was killed. There were a series of meetings and peace talks, and by February '96, the government and the Zapatistas signed the San Andres Accords. EZLN members who had committed terrorism were released from prison. In the aftermath, Zapatistas continually controlled small areas of Chiapas, but would not be legally recognized by the government. In 1997, the same year that Zedillo privatized the state railway company, 45 pacifist Catholic indigenous people called Las Abejas, or the Bees, were murdered in the small village of Acetal in Chiapas. The Bees were supporters of the EZLN, and among them included pregnant women and 18 children. The perpetrators were the right-wing paramilitary group, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Mexican presidents had come from this party for 71 years, and 2000 would be their year of reckoning. Between October 22nd and November 9th, 1998, Hurricane Mitch, the deadliest hurricane in Central America on record since 1780, ravaged the area. Guatemala was the scene of severe flooding and hundreds of millions in damages, leaving millions homeless. Mitch killed over 7,000 people in Honduras, where all 18 of the country's regions or departments were impacted. 70 to 80% of Honduras's transportation network was destroyed, along with 70% of its crops. In the end, there were $665 million in damages. As a result of Hurricane Mitch, the U.S. suspended deportations of undocumented people to Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador, and offered those already in the country the ability to apply for temporary protection status. But, reported Ginger Thompson, by applying, Central Americans make themselves known to the INS, and some fear that the INS may move to deport Central Americans after TPS expires. Some lawyers urge clients to apply for TPS so that they can get work permits and better jobs. They also believe that TPS may be extended, and that in any case, there is unlikely to be a deportation campaign after TPS expires. Foreign countries wrangled together $6.3 billion to help the ailing countries after Hurricane Mitch. There were 3,800 more deaths from Mitch in Nicaragua, where massive landslides left entire areas in ruins and uncovered long buried landmines. Nicaragua was struggling from social and economic decline under Violeta Chamorro between 1990 and 1997. Public spending per person on health went from $35 in 1989 to just $14 in 1995, as child care centers closed and life expectancy dropped from 66 to 60 in the same period. More women became entangled in sex work and crime due to financial and food insecurity, and these were the issues binding Nicaragua's election in '96. Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas lost to Arnaldo Aylman of the Constitutional Liberal Party. During this election, Ortega attempted to tone down his anti-imperialist and American rhetoric, but he was no match for Aylman, who would go on to grow foreign investment. In 1995, the same year that the Colombian native and incipient queen of Latin, Shakira, went on her first international tour, the multi-billion-dollar money laundering schemes of the Cali cartel were brought into the spotlight. An estimated $3 billion a year was being invested into American companies in exchange for electronics and other goods sent back to Colombia. More money was being spent on paintings in London and New York and luxury housing and real estate development in Colombia. The country had benefited from the illicit trade, even generating a $5 billion budget surplus after a long period of decline. In October 1995, 33 companies were identified as fronts for the Cali cartel, whom Clinton ordered U.S. companies to cease trading with. Sanctions were placed on known cartel associates, and stricter protocols for sending money to Colombia were implemented. Reported the New York Times, besides employing innovative trade schemes, authorities say drug traffickers are shipping cash in everything from used cars and dolls to television sets and refrigerated containers of bull semen. When a forklift accidentally punctured a shipping pallet in a warehouse on West 32nd Street, workers were shocked to see $100 bills tumble out. By the end of '95, all of the major players of the Cali cartel were in custody, but lieutenants were ready to replace them. Thousands of acres of drug crops and 243 drug labs were destroyed in crackdowns in the first half of the year alone. But rumors that President Ernesto Samper funded his 1994 campaign with drug money from the cartel reached such a fever pitch that he admitted to it in January 1996, saying he was tricked and demanded an investigation. Clinton sent $1 billion in aid to Colombia in wake of the scandal to fight drug trafficking. Samper was absolved of wrongdoing, but members of his team, including his campaign manager, were jailed for corruption. Samper's reputation took another hit in September 1996 when 7.4 pounds of heroin was found on his jet in Bogota before a scheduled flight to New York. That same year, the Marxist-Leninist group, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, launched a fresh campaign of terrorism funded with illegal mining, drugs, extortion, ransoms, and other unsavory means. On February 11, 1997, in Bogota, 800,000 workers walked out in protest of privatization and austerity. These included teachers, public transit workers, oil workers, healthcare professionals, and prison guards. Union leaders threatened to extend the strike outside of Bogota into 5 other cities. This general strike triggered the government to agree to a 20% increase in public workers' salaries just 7 days later. The protests were significant because Colombia had long been hostile to union leaders. As a result of the strike, multiple union leaders would be killed in the following years, including the head of Colombian Coca-Cola workers, likely by right-wing death squads with close links to the authorities. In 1996 alone, 20 union workers at Coca-Cola had been disappeared or assassinated. Local Coca-Cola executives were accused of using paramilitary groups and death squads to stomp out unions, culminating in plans for a lawsuit by the International Labor Rights Fund and the United Steelworkers of America. Over in Venezuela in December 1994, the pardoned socialist and former Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez met with Castro in Cuba. Chavez was recovering after the 1992 failed coup of President Carlos Perez, who had reneged on his promise to reject IMF funds. Chavez toured Central and South America and built support in Venezuela, reportedly receiving military training from Cuba. Despite being skeptical of the electoral system and doubtful that he'd have the chance to win, in July 1997, Chavez created the Fifth Republic Movement Party to seek presidential election the following year and change the constitution. The party focused on rousing the poor and implementing Bolivarianism, a strain of socialism that centers anti-imperialism, Latin American self-sufficiency, nationalism, and equity in resources. The 1998 elections were the first with National Electoral Council impartiality. Initially, Irene Size, a former Miss Universe and a mayor of Chacao Municipality, made a splash. Reported the LA Times, a political independent, she focuses on pragmatism rather than ideology. She has hired top-notch administrators and listens to their advice about setting the budget and taxes and running public services such as the police and garbage collection. At the same time, she has avoided the endemic political patronage and corruption that have undermined Venezuelans' confidence in government. Irene was so popular in Chacao that she was re-elected to her mayoral position with 96% of the vote. However, for national leadership, Irene was beat out by central-right candidate Enrique Salas Romer, who eventually won runner-up. The elections were heavily impacted by the Asian economic crisis as well. As the campaign progressed, Chavez tempered himself to be more centrist, though he still was open about his goal to change the constitution, pledging to open up elections to more than just two parties and to end corruption and poverty. With a 63% voter turnout, Chavez won 56.2% of the vote. He promptly rolled out a new constitution and renamed the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. The Constitution had new protections for indigenous people, extended the presidential term to 6 years, and weakened checks and balances by reducing Congress into a unicameral National Assembly. Next came Plan Bolivar 2000, which sent 70,000 military members to repair infrastructure, deliver food and medicine, and provide vaccines around the country beginning in February 1999. Chavez was a pragmatist who didn't turn down a chance to ring the closing bell at the New York Stock Exchange in 1999. Venezuela nurtured relationships with Cuba and Iran and helped Venezuela's oil industry via a plan to tour OPEC nations. Chavez's victory and achievements would become highly influential in Latin America in the next decade. In October 1998, former Chilean dictator Auguste Pinochet went to London for medical treatment. A judge in Spain issued an international arrest warrant for Pinochet's crimes against Spanish citizens. The UK government placed Pinochet under house arrest as debates about universal jurisdiction ensued. Just a few months earlier, a top aide of Saddam Hussein had visited Vienna for medical treatment without being arrested as a perpetrator of genocide against the Kurds. Why? Austria wanted to stay on good terms with Iraq. And this was the most common scenario for top world leaders before Pinochet. Some wanted the elderly Pinochet to face full penalties from international powers for his human rights abuses, while others like Margaret Thatcher campaigned that he be returned to Chile to face charges from his own people. A British court ruled that Pinochet should be extradited to Spain, but a mental exam found him incompetent and he was released and sent back to Chile in 2000. In 1995, President Alberto Fujimori coasted through the Peruvian general elections. His estranged wife Susana Higuchi unsuccessfully ran for president against him and started a hunger strike on January 18th to protest a new law passed by Congress that banned the president's family from attaining national office. She ended the strike 6 days later. The freshly elected Congress also passed a law declaring amnesty for law enforcement and military officials accused of human rights abuses between 1980 and 1995 to public outcry. The Catholic Church in Lima was one high high-profile group that called it dangerous. In the wake of ongoing Shining Path terrorism, only 6 legislators out of 130 voted against the measure. Said Fujimori, "Of course, amnesty is a controversial measure, but this is part of the strategy to fight terrorism. I don't deny there were isolated cases of human rights violations by the military in the past, but I want to put this period of violence behind us with this amnesty measure." Described to AP, the Peruvian leader said he did not understand how the United States could be so critical when Americans were also demanding effective measures to fight terrorism after the Oklahoma bombing. In addition to easing tensions with Chile, Peru resolved an ongoing border dispute with Ecuador in the extremely short 34-day Cenepa War, which began on my birthday in 1995 and ended 2 days later. Hundreds were killed on both sides. Though he had once been affectionately called Chinaman, Fujimori was now Pinochet, a comparison to the former dictator of Chile. Said Cesar Hildebrand in 1995, "Fujimorism installs with each day that passes a system that operated for 6 decades in Mexico, the model of a single-party system sustained by the army, the business sector, and the greater part of the electronic media. We are watching the birth of a hidden dictatorship." In response to Fujimori's growing fascism, university students and staff in Lima protested the unfair elections and the state takeover of 2 private institutions. Fujimori claimed the move was to stamp out rebel infiltration. Hours before Fujimori passed the university law, a car bomb exploded outside of a luxury hotel casino and killed 4 people in Lima, and the perpetrators were believed to be the Shining Path. On December 17, 1996, 14 members of the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, or MRTA, attacked the home of the Japanese ambassador while he was hosting a party, taking hundreds of people hostage for the next 126 days. The MRTA, who are Marxist-Leninists, demanded the release of approximately 450 members from prison, a reformation of neoliberal policies, and prison reform. They were heavily armed and wired the home with explosives, making an armed assault ill-advised. As Peruvian stock prices plummeted, Fujimori addressed the public 5 days later, after the MRTA leader Nestor Serpa said that all non-Peruvian government hostages would be released. The group allowed female hostages to leave, and eventually all were released except for 72 men. A female journalist named Sally Bowen, who attempted to stay, was denied. Fujimori attempted peaceful resolution, trying to convince other countries, primarily Cuba, to accept the terrorists as political exiles. The MRTA reneged on their promise to kill a foreign minister hostage if Fujimori didn't show up for negotiations, making them look weak. They also attempted to persuade hostages to become leftists. Reported Diana Jean Shimo on the Recollections of a Hostage, he announced that there would be no killing, at least not by the Tupac Amaru. Instead, the hostages say, Mr. Serpa tried to win over his captives, engaging them in philosophical conversations about the free market economy and the poor, whose lot he felt would never improve. Though his band of rebels could not hold hundreds of people against their will over the long run, he used the first few days to expound his ideas, seemingly in an attempt to send the first captives out as favorable emissaries. Throughout the crisis, the Peruvian government prepared for a raid by sneaking in surveillance equipment with food deliveries. As the days stretched into weeks and months, the MRTA members began relaxing their guard, even having a daily period of soccer that would ultimately quicken their downfall. With American military forces on standby, Peruvian officials attempted to dig tunnels underneath the building, but MRTA heard and stopped negotiating. Despite this, a small number of hostages were in constant contact with Peruvian forces. They were informed that a raid would begin on April 22, 1997. Peruvian commandos were instructed to take no prisoners. At approximately 3:23 p.m., when MRTA members played soccer, 3 simultaneous explosives were triggered and commandos swarmed the building. By the end of the raid, 1 hostage and all 14 members of the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement were dead. 1 MRTA operative had attempted to walk out with the hostages and was seen, taken to the back of the residence, and executed. The incident ended the MRTA as a threat to Peru and doubled Fujimori's approval ratings, giving him good PR. Reported Diana Jean Shimo, Mr. Fujimori, whose popularity rating skyrocketed 29 points to 67% in just a few days, returned to the residence a day after the raid to be photographed with the bloated and headless bodies of his enemies at his feet in macabre footage taken by government cameramen and broadcast repeatedly on television. The circumstances of the deaths of the terrorists, 8 of whom had died after being captured or surrendering, were murky until the next century. Their bodies weren't returned to their families, and 4 of them were teenagers. An MRTA spokesperson commented on Fujimori's alleged victory for Peru, saying, "A vast segment of the population still suffers from poverty, hunger, and a lack of proper medical care, and these problems are increasing." The end of the crisis at the ambassador's residence showed that Fujimori exclusively relies on military means. In the background of all of this, Fujimori and Vladimiro Montesinos, the head of the NIS, continued to corrupt the Ministry of Economy and Finance and sterilize Peru's indigenous population through their sinister Plan Verde. In 1999, Fujimori announced he was running for president again, but his support was eroded by ongoing censorship and corruption, and the new millennium would be rough for Fujimori. Over in Brazil, under sociologist Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who began his presidential term on January 1st, 1995, the economy somewhat stabilized after years of hyperinflation, though debt would rise for 7 years. As a neoliberal, Cardoso notably improved foreign outreach, privatized public industries, created new regulatory agencies, implemented universal primary education, and erected the Ministry of Sports, which was turned into the Ministry of Tourism before being separated into 2 categories. Decree 1775 in 1996 designated indigenous lands at the discretion of the Minister of Justice and opened up these lands to be contested by commercial and private entities. By April 1996, 40 different indigenous lands were hit with 500 lawsuits, and indigenous Brazilians were rightfully upset. Cardoso also claimed to have 1 foot in the kitchen or to be slightly mulatto and campaigned on racial equality. To his credit, he was the first Brazilian president to address racism and wealth inequality, highly significant in the country with the largest black population outside of nations on the African continent. Afro-Brazilians, or pretos, were reported to experience harsh discrimination in employment, higher rates of poverty and violence, and to be missing from prominent positions of power. There were abhorrent laws like elevator segregation. On Brazilian TV, which was being hotly debated by the mid-90s for its sexual content, most performers were white, like the extremely popular children's TV show host, singer, Playboy model, and actress Xuxa. The whiteness and thinness of Brazil's TV stars would fuel a thriving plastic surgery culture where procedures are often free or low cost, which is based in eugenics and racism. In 1995, plastic surgeon and creator of the Brazilian butt lift, Ivo Pitangui, published a book encouraging the connection between physical beauty and happiness. By 1998, when 60 Minutes was profiling the doctor, he had operated on over 45,000 people, some for free. Described the Chicago Tribune, every Wednesday morning, the poor line the humid corridors for a chance to be seen by their city's virtuoso, and in some cases, operated on by one of his interns. Said Pitangui, "I wanted to take all the mystique away and make it something any social class could obtain. More democratic." At the time, Rio had more plastic surgeons per capita than any other city in the world. On November 24th, 1995, Brazil honored a 17th century Afro-Brazilian abolitionist named Zumbi. The event drew out 30,000 pretos to march against discrimination, becoming one of the largest black assemblies in the country's history. Afro-Brazilian leaders would link with Cardoso to discuss implementing affirmative action programs and civil rights protections similar to America's. Afro-Brazilians gained more visibility and fragile expectations of human rights, but still had to deal with police, who could legally torture and extort money from civilians. Torture didn't become illegal until 1997, after police brutality was caught on camera. This was also the same year that popular singer, comedian, and future politician Tiririca issued the racist song, "Look at Her Hair." He claimed the song was a joke about his Afro-Brazilian wife, but a Rio de Janeiro-based civil rights group sued. A judge ruled that the song, distributed by Sony, be pulled from the album. Lastly, like many many Latin American countries, Brazil was impacted by the global financial crisis buckling Asia and Russia in 1998. It wasn't as bad as the recession that wrecked neighbor Argentina from 1998 to 2002, but investors fled, and as a result, Brazil got a $41.5 billion rescue package from global institutions in November 1998. Now, let's take it to East Asia. On September 5th, 1997, the Albanian Indian nun Mother Teresa died in India, 6 days after Princess Diana. Her legacy in Calcutta would be mixed, but a campaign for her to be turned into a Catholic saint began immediately. A few months later, in the Indian state of Bihar, a banned anti-Marxist militia of landlords named Ranveer Sena killed 58 to 63 people on December 1st, 1997. To destroy the rising power of Marxist-Leninist factions known as Naxalites, the Ranveer Sena were responsible for other mass killings and rapes and faced zero consequences. Remember how earlier I mentioned India and its neighbor Pakistan hadn't signed the nuclear testing ban treaty? In May 1998, India conducted 5 tests that triggered Pakistan to do its own tests as a show of strength 2 weeks later. The US replied to both countries with economic sanctions that remained in place for the remainder of the decade, while both nations faced backlash from their own citizens. Wrote Tariq Ali, "What can justify the ease with which the powerful ruling elites in both countries have spent billions of dollars to inject the earth with nuclear dust? Both countries are stalked by poverty, disease, malnutrition, and mass illiteracy. And both countries were also impacted by the Asian financial crisis, which had began in Thailand." The Thai economy had been rising steadily between 1985 and 1996, but a drop in exports and investors selling off their Thai-bought assets based on a rumor that the government didn't have enough money to back up its currency triggered a financial crisis that would ripple across the world. Without going too deeply, as the baht value dropped by 20%, finance companies collapsed, the stock market dropped, employment fell, and wages and welfare went unpaid. In response to Thailand's crisis, other closely tied nations like the Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia attempted to safeguard their own currencies. The Malaysian Prime Minister accused George Soros, a billionaire who had made money during the UK's Black Wednesday, of orchestrating the crisis, generating some of the earliest Soros globalism conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, Clinton viewed the economic chaos as a few little glitches in the road. Alan Greenspan was cheerful that the crisis is likely to accelerate the dismantling in many Asian countries of the remnants of a system with large elements of government-directed investment. Essentially, these Eastern markets were being made over to better suit Western interests. While most countries took Western advice to safeguard their currencies by depleting their reserves, China decided not to and largely wasn't impacted by the crisis. The IMF handed out billion-dollar structural adjustment packages with rules attached, including closing insolvent banks and firing people. The American Fed cut interest rates 3 times in fall 1998 in response to the global financial crisis, eventually stabilizing the US economy, with the Dow Jones closing above the 10,000 level for the first time in its history in March 1999. Most nations impacted by the Asian financial crisis, including Thailand, would begin to bounce back by 1998-1999, but that period of crisis was impactful. Indonesia was the country hardest hit by the Asian crisis, compounded by ongoing riots between 1996 and 1997. Its economy shrank by 13.7%, and structural reforms mandated by the IMF weren't equally applied to longtime leader Suharto's family. In January 1998, he paused 15 government-subsidized projects, many linked to his family. In that same month, food staple prices rose by 80%, triggering more criticism of Suharto by top politicians. In March, America promised $70 million in food and medical aid, but it wasn't enough. People were unemployed, hungry, and angry, which culminated with anti-Chinese sentiment. Native Indonesians, or pribumi, often disliked the 2% of the country's ethnically Chinese citizens who were culturally Indonesian, believing them to be collaborators of the corrupt Suharto regime. In the summer of 1997, Naomi Klein recalled during the wake of the Asian financial crisis, one day, factory workers could buy fish and rice, and the next they were subsisting on rice alone. In casual conversations at restaurants and taxis, everyone seemed to have the same theory about who was to blame. The Chinese, I was told. Between May 4th and 15th, 1998, there were small-scale protests and looting. worsened on May 12th when the Indonesian army shot and killed 4 student protesters at Trisakti University. Infuriated, even more pribumi began rioting, looting, and attacking Chinese Indonesians. In Chinese-majority areas, citizens patrolled against violence. Roughly 10,000 American citizens in the country were ordered to return home by the U.S. government as chaos reigned. 400 to 1,000 people were killed in a deliberately torched mall in Jakarta, and most were Chinese Indonesians. Over 100 women were reported raped, and Chinese temples and businesses were destroyed. On May 21st, 1998, Suharto announced his resignation, generating celebration by Indonesians. But the problems weren't over. By December, an estimated 40% of Indonesians, or 80 million, were living in poverty. Vice President B.J. Habibie became the president when Suharto resigned. Although he was just an interim leader, he got a lot done. He greenlit investigations into Suharto and his family for corruption, banned distinctions between non-indigenous and indigenous Indonesians, lifted the ban on teaching Mandarin, okayed political parties, and ended censorship by destroying the information agency. He also held a referendum for East Timor, who voted for independence on August 30th, 1999, despite harassment and threats of violence. A militia group of anti-independence East Timorese, supported by some members of the Indonesian military, would kill up to 1,400 people in retaliation between 1998 and 2002 in what is known as the East Timorese crisis. Though the U.S. knew that the Indonesian military had prepared to carry out this slaughter, Clinton did not want to jeopardize the U.S.'s relationship with a primary trading partner. He didn't suspend military relations with Indonesia until September 9th, 1999, after tremendous international pressure.
The Indonesian government and military are responsible for the safety of the East Timorese and of the UN mission there. If Indonesia does not end the violence, it must invite the international community to assist in restoring security. It must allow international relief agencies to help people on the ground. It must move forward with the transition to independence. Having allowed the vote and gotten such a clear, unambiguous answer, we cannot have a reversal of course here.
In nearby Melbourne, protesters demanded that the Australian government push the United Nations to initiate a peacekeeping force to enter East Timor. As the crisis continued, Habibie lost leadership to Gus Dur in 1999, who lifted the ban on Chinese New Year celebrations, signifying that he would further be an ally to Chinese Indonesians in the new millennium. In the Philippines, former dictator wife Imelda Marcos made her political comeback in 1995 as an elected congresswoman. The following year, the ozone disco fire in Quezon City killed at least 162 people, mostly high school and college students. It was one of the worst fires in Filipino history. In 1998, Imelda pressed her luck in a failed campaign for president. She came in 9th place to Joseph Estrada, a former actor and mayor who served as Fidel Ramos's vice president. The country's foreign debt would rise as rumors swirled about Estrada's embezzlement and corruption. In North Korea, famine, flooding, and the hoarding of food by farmers and the military in the 90s under Kim Jong-il led to a dire situation. North Korea accepted food aid in 1996 from the UN's World Food Program as a result, and the US was the biggest donor, sending over 600,000 tons of foodstuffs, most of which didn't end up going to those who needed it most. There was a rise in illegal businesses and smuggling, while government officials looked the other way from small-scale bartering and commerce. Approximately 250,000 North Koreans fled to China as 1 million people died of starvation and illness. Orphan children were detained in camps and died of malnutrition. In 1998, Kim Jong-il implemented Songun, or military first, becoming official government policy. Wrote the official newspaper of Workers' Party of Korea, "Never before have the status and role of the People's Army been so extraordinarily elevated as today when it is being led energetically by the respected and beloved Comrade Supreme Commander." In South Korea, a number of companies foundational to the growing phenomenon known as K-pop emerged from 1995 onward. The group CL Taji and Boys reoriented the Korean music industry to teen idol music. In the wake of the Asian financial crisis, the government decided to invest money into the music industry to grow the country's soft power, and that investment would pay dividends in the coming decades. Additionally, South Korea was officially a democracy in 1997 when Kim Dae-jung, a former political prisoner, was elected to the presidency. He authorized IMF structural adjustment, courted foreign investment, upgraded the nation's technological infrastructure, tripled government spending on welfare, and earned the nickname neoliberal revolutionist. Japan began 1995 with the Great Hanshin Awaji earthquake on January 17th. It killed nearly 6,500 people and injured up to 40,000 more. In September 1995 in Okinawa, where 29,000 U.S. troops were stationed, a Navy sailor and 2 Marines named Marcus Gill, Rodrigo Hart, and Kendrick Ladet raped a 12-year-old Japanese girl. Japan identified the men to the U.S. military so they could be charged and tried, but didn't release their photos to media, fearing that there would be racial backlash. Gill, Hart, and Ladet were escorted to and from court with shields. On October 21st, 1995, 60 to 85,000 Okinawans protested the U.S. military. On one hand, it was because the U.S. attempted to maintain custody of the rapist, but also because Okinawans were fed up with the U.S. occupation of Japan. The problem of rape was ongoing. According to Masamichi Esanoe, in Okinawa and the U.S. military identity making in the age of globalization, between 1972 and 1995, 4,784 crimes, including 22 murders, 356 robberies, and 110 rapes, have been committed by U.S. military personnel in Okinawa. Said a high school protester, "Give us back the tranquility of Okinawa. Give us back the peaceful island without the military, without the tragedy." In response to protests, the U.S. allowed the Japanese to get early custody of future U.S. military suspects in rape and murder cases. All 3 of the rapists confessed without an attorney, to which they later claimed the U.S. military told them to falsely confess in exchange for mercy. Their confessions and convictions stroked debate back home. U.S. Ambassador Walter Mondale called them animals, while their wives and mothers claimed that they were innocent. But Gill confessed again after legal counsel, triggering Harp and Ladet to claim that they helped Gill abduct the girl but didn't actually participate in the rape. All 3 were found guilty. Teresa Watanabe reported that rape convictions under Japanese law normally result in sentences of 3 to 4 years, but U.S. courts-martial for rape in Okinawa have typically carried a minimum sentence of 10 years, according to a Japanese attorney who has represented more than 300 U.S. servicemen on the southern island over the past 29 years. Ladet received 6.5 years of hard labor from Japan, while the other 2 rapists received 7 years. So, do y'all remember our discussion about victims' rights in the last episode? The victim's father said, "If existing laws permitted, I wish to kill the 3 American soldiers." The survivor said, "I hope they will be kept in jail as long as they live." Ladet, once freed, raped and murdered a coworker in Kennesaw, Georgia in 2006 before killing himself. This story has largely disappeared from 90s narratives as much as other rape stories, but particularly because of the angle of U.S. imperialism. It also highlighted a key feature of military campaigns throughout history. What were good, honorable military men getting into overseas while serving their countries? U.S. Navy Admiral Richard C. Mack said, "I think it was absolutely stupid. I've said several times, for the price that they paid to rent the car used in the crime, they could have just had a girl." For saying that the rapist should have just bought a sex worker, insinuating that it was routine practice in the military, Mack was demoted. The rape incident also highlighted Okinawa's frustration with Japan because their quality of life was being sacrificed to maintain U.S.-Japan relations. The governor of Okinawa, Masahide Ota, refused to sign an important land lease with the U.S. military in 1995 and 1998, saying, "In the past 50 years, Okinawa has always cooperated with the Japanese and U.S. governments, but they did not listen to Okinawa voices. This time, they should listen to us." Also in 1995, the Aum Shinrikyo cult attacked 3 subway lines in Tokyo with sarin nerve gas in 5 coordinated attacks during rush hour. The attacks killed 13 people and injured up to 5,800 others, leading to a raid and arrest of over 200 Aum Shinrikyo cult members, including the group's leader, Shoko Asahara. He and 12 others were executed, but the group continued to spread its philosophy of starting the apocalypse. A rape controversy with political consequences, an extreme earthquake, a murderous doomsday cult, and that hostage crisis over in Peru added to Japan's other problem, the economy. Japan's overzealous lending in the 80s continued to take its toll at the end of the 90s. Between 1991 and 2003, the Japanese GDP only grew 1.14% annually, and powerful firms like Toyota, Sony, and Toshiba would face increased competition from other East Asian companies. The impact of the broader East Asian financial crisis of 1997 and 1998 worsened the country's finances. And on June 12, 1998, Japan announced it was in a recession for the first time in 23 years. In the midst of the financial downturn, suicides grew, with an estimated 90 people per day taking their own lives in 1998 alone, or roughly 32,663 Japanese people that year. Many of these were by 40 to 59-year-old and 20-something-year-old salarymen who felt set adrift when they lost their life-defining careers. Reported Stephanie Strom in 1999, typically in Japanese companies, subordinates offer their department heads absolute loyalty, and in return, Japanese executives take care of their charges with an almost fatherly devotion. Now, with pressures to lay off employees, cut costs, and improve efficiency, neither the boss nor the subordinate can necessarily fulfill his side of the traditional bargain. There was also a significant increase in suicides among Japanese children. In fact, children and teens were tackling new problems of violence and apathy in school. In Osaka, the number of teens arrested for crimes was up by 51% in the late 90s. Physical attacks on teachers were up by 20%, and Japan considered harsher penalties for juvenile offenders. The 1997 beheadings of a 10 and 11-year-old by a 14-year-old boy earned condemnation in headlines. Japanese films like Fudo, The New Generation, and books like Battle Royale, which would later be adapted into a killer movie, captured the grim realities of pressure, conformity, delinquency, and violence among teens. Explained Howard French, Japan's national teenage crime rates pale in comparison with those in America. Still, for Japan, whose conservative, nearly mono-ethnic society sometimes conveys the feel of an immense village where elaborate social codes are universally recognized and respected by nearly all, the spread of criminal behavior among young people represents a dramatic departure from the norm. And if the phenomenon goes unchecked, many Japanese fear it will destroy one of the features that contributes most to Japan's sense of uniqueness: unquestioned security. This unquestioned security was doubted again in 1998 when a mother of 4 killed 4 people when she poisoned a pot of curry with arsenic at a festival in Wakayama, Japan. In 1999, the same year that Japan introduced a new flag that looks suspiciously a lot like its old one, Japan's popular franchise Pokemon took over the Western world, increasing its soft power. It was many a US child's introduction to anime and manga, which flourished and blossomed into a profitable industry with creations like Princess Mononoke, Naruto, Sailor Moon, Perfect Blue, and One Piece.
Oh shit.
The 1998 film Rush Hour, starring Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker, grossed over $244 million worldwide and became an iconic comedy film. Mariah Carey, whose song Fantasy was featured in the film, hit the red carpet with the movie stars at Grauman's Chinese Theater in LA. Chan would say years later, "I dislike Rush Hour the most, but ironically, it sold really well." The film began shooting in November 1997, just months after the midnight handover of Hong Kong to China from the UK on July 1st.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I should like on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen and of the entire British people to express our thanks, admiration, affection, and good wishes to all the people of Hong Kong who have been such staunch and special friends over so many generations.
Hong Kong had approximately $300 billion in its coffers when it was being handed back to China. And the last British governor, Chris Patten, made Hong Kong's Legislative Council entirely elected and expanded its power, pissing off pro-Beijing Hong Kongers so much that they called him the whore of the East. He'd say, "You can dismantle institutions, but you can't dismantle benchmarks." Indeed, the Legislative Council was disbanded shortly after the handover and replaced with a Chinese-approved council, but many Hong Kongers still longed for democracy. Hong Kong people had grown accustomed to over a century of cultural autonomy separate from China, so the mainland promised that there would be one country, two systems for the next 50 years, and there's only 12 years left on that time bomb. In theory, China would handle diplomacy and military issues, while the Special Administrative Division of Hong Kong handled its own local government and systems, with China eventually absorbing Hong Kong back fully into the fold, though resistance to that has been strong from the start. In Rush Hour, where Jackie Chan fights his fellow Chinese person for the return of a Chinese ambassador's daughter and has an entire scene where he attempts to preserve ancient Chinese art, the biggest villain of the film is revealed to be a British police officer. It was funny, but it was deep too. When the British were set to hand over Hong Kong, their customs and impact left a simmering ideological and political battle caught between two propaganda machines.
Already, China vows to roll back political freedoms come July 1st. Opposition parties effectively outlawed. Any criticism of the government, a criminal offense. But that won't stop Martin Lee. He is the most important and outspoken democratic leader in Hong Kong and China's public enemy #1. In a trip through Sacramento and on to Washington to meet with President Clinton, Mr. Lee seeks local support.
And I want people all over the world to keep watching Hong Kong, to make sure that China knows that all the eyes of the world are on Hong Kong. I think this is our only hope.
A study by the United States Information Agency 4 months before the handover found 35% of the population wanted to become a special economic region of China, outnumbering the separate groups who wanted to remain a British colony, become a Commonwealth, and those who wanted independence. And those who wanted to rejoin China tended to be born before 1965. Reporters spoke with Hong Kong dissidents about the likelihood of social repression and a retreat to communism, and others who believed that Hong Kong's liberalized society might even ease repression on the mainland. After all, China had been rapidly changing since the 80s, and entrepreneurs wanted in on the special economic zones. U.S. companies had $14 billion invested in Hong Kong enterprises, so they would love to see a liberalized economy work both ways.
Simon Liu, one of the most powerful men in South China, shows off the chopper pad on top of his 80-story hotel, the tallest in the region. He says after reunification, China will benefit greatly from Hong Kong's strong U.S. and California connections.
From this part of the world to this part of the world.
Some Central Californians are already tapping in to China's market.
We're doing multi-million-dollar on this.
West Sacramento businesswoman Margaret Wong has many multi-million-dollar deals through Hong Kong and into China, making her company one of the fastest growing in the state.
I think with Hong Kong turnover to China in July 1997 is going to give California more opportunities to get into China.
Hong Kong's first tests were navigating the Asian financial crisis and an outbreak of the bird flu from birds supplied from China, which led to the culling of over 1 million chickens. As for the Hong Kong-born Jackie Chan, the nice guy persona generated from the Rush Hour franchise and press in the West would obscure darker activities. In 1999, when confronted at a press conference with knowledge about his extramarital daughter, who he would never take care of or meet, he'd say about the affair, he only committed a fault that many men in the world commit. So, in China, Deng Xiaoping died at the age of 92 on February 19, 1997. At the time, China was the 8th largest trade nation in the world and the biggest borrower from the World Bank. There was universal health care, a decline of infant mortality, better education than what was previously offered, and more access to the outside world. With the rigorous business of special economic zones, more women from rural villages traveled for factory work to earn more money. By 1996, a third of the Chinese working population earned approximately $30,000 a year, quadruple the amount of earnings from 1978 to 1995. However, 65 million Chinese people, according to the World Bank, were absolutely poor. Jiang Zemin, who was now fully out of Deng's shadows, continued his predecessor's policies of reform, but with more panache. For instance, he notably sang Elvis's Love Me Tender in 1996 at the APEC summit and danced with Chirac's wife 3 years later. China's period of isolation was waning, though not without controversy. In 1995, when President Lee Teng-hui of Taiwan, a country claimed by China under its One China principle, accepted an invitation to speak at his alma mater Cornell University, it set off another clash between the mainland and the island. Because Taiwan operates as an independent nation outside of China, other nations were forced to choose one to have relations with. Most of the world chose the more powerful China, leaving 29 countries willing to have official ties to Taiwan in 1995. So, the US had been prepared to deny Teng-hui a visa to not piss off China, but a faction of pro-Taiwanese Americans and lawyers lobbied for the president to be allowed entry so he could speak at Cornell. It became a congressional issue, with senators like Jesse Helms, who was a fierce critic of China, supporting the visit. Teng-hui's visit was approved, and 300 Taiwanese journalists flew to Cornell to watch him speak about the democratization of Taiwan on June 10th. He said, "Some say that it is impossible for us to break out of the diplomatic isolation we face, but we will do our utmost to demand the impossible. And Taiwan is a country with independent sovereignty." China was so mad that it decided to take it out on Taiwan. On July 7th, they declared a series of missile and naval tests in and around the strait, separating the mainland from the island in the third Taiwanese Strait crisis. For a week in late July, China launched its missiles and military exercises that not just worried the Taiwanese and allies, but disturbed the shipping industry. The United States sent its own carrier battle groups to surveil, waiting for the drama to escalate, and to assert to China that it too could flex its muscles. In January and February of 1996, an estimated 100,000 members of the People's Liberation Army were pressed into the strait for new drills that rattled Taiwan and affected the nation's first democratic presidential election by generating more support for Lee Teng-hui, who won. Taiwanese who lived in other countries had been so moved to vote that many had flown back home just to exercise their right. The US's military began withdrawing from the area and the tensions cooled, though the People's Liberation Army would reassess its capability in dealing with aircraft carriers, realizing the need for more modern weapons. Taiwan would look forward to pushing for a One China, One Taiwan movement that granted them sovereignty and restored relations with the mainland. In 1996, Zemin and the leaders of Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, dubbed the Shanghai Five, met in Shanghai and agreed to cooperate to combat ethnic and religious tensions in each other's countries. Zemin's visit to the US for the Chinese-American Summit in 1997 was instrumental to his plan to bolster foreign relations and the Chinese image, seeking an eventual admission to the World Trade Organization. Zemin even visited Williamsburg, Virginia, and put on a hat for cameras. The new image for China was necessary, reported the Associated Press. In a new Gallup poll taken for CNN and USA Today, 36% said they regarded China as unfriendly or an outright enemy. In 1983, before Tiananmen Square, the figure was 21%. That was in the wake of Zemin's visit to the States. A Clinton administration official told Stephen Erlanger on the cusp of the Chinese-American Summit, "Our most important foreign policy problem is ensuring a relatively benign China for the next century."
Both our countries can best advance our interests and our values by working together rather than standing apart. For together we can lay the groundwork for a safer, better world, where peace prevails and prosperity grows, where we join to fight the threats that none of us can conquer alone, where all our children enjoy clean air, clean water, and a healthy future, and where people are treated with dignity, free to express their beliefs and observe their fates.
Said President Zeman, I wish to take this opportunity to convey to the great American people the cordial greetings and best wishes of the 1.2 billion Chinese people. 18 years ago, Mr. Deng Xiaoping solemnly announced here that a new era for Sino-American relations had begun. Both China and the United States are countries that carry considerable weight in the world. In the new international situation, the shared interests between China and the United States have increased rather than decreased. Our potential for cooperation has expanded rather than diminished. Our two countries share broad common interests and shoulder a common responsibility on major issues bearing upon human survival and development. Despite the friendly words, the two leaders clashed over human rights in Tiananmen Square, with Zeman refusing to apologize, and Clinton's attempt to attack China on Tiananmen Square earned mixed reviews from Americans. Opined Seth Faison, in trying to find the right approach, Clinton has been criticized by business people for talking about human rights too much and lambasted by protesters for talking about them too little. Zeman's visit also brought out pro-Tibet and Chinese democracy protests. The Tibet issue was especially potent because in 1995, the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibetan Buddhism crowned a 6-year-old boy as the next reincarnation. The boy was promptly taken into custody by the People's Republic of China and has not been seen publicly since. As pro-Tibet protesters in the US gathered, said Zeman, it was our democratic reform that emancipated some 1 million serfs and slaves through peaceful means. Historical advances as such cannot be rolled back. With the support of the central government and the rest of the country, today's Tibet is developing prosperity, and people there are living and working in happiness and contentment. Despite his belief that Tibetans did not want to be independent, Zeman would similarly be met with protests when he visited Switzerland and the UK in 1999. The protests were so bad in Switzerland, where some people climbed on buildings, that Zeman skipped a meeting with government officials because they hadn't maintained control of protesters to his satisfaction, telling the Swiss they lost a good friend. Conversations about human rights in China continued thanks to the Falun Gong movement, which had grown even more popular despite attempts to suppress it. In 1995, the Chinese Communist Party mandated that all Qigong groups like Falun Gong create Communist Party offshoots and become officially attached to the government in an attempt to maintain control. Chinese propaganda argued that Falun Gong was oppositional to communism, atheism, medicine, reason, and science, and therefore antithetical to the state of China itself. By attaching Falun Gong to the Communist Party, China hoped to maintain control over the growing phenomenon. But Falun Gong resisted and withdrew from state oversight, leading to government surveillance and more repression. Falun Gong books were banned in July 1996, but the movement continued to spread, with up to 70 million members by 1999. On April 22nd of that year, Falun Gong members leading a sit-in were arrested and beaten in Tianjin on orders of the Ministry of Public Security. 3 days later, 10,000 Falun Gong members protested for the release of prisoners in Beijing at the Zongnai compound. It was the largest protest since Tiananmen Square 10 years before. The protest was peacefully dissolved when the government assured protesters that the prisoners would be released and Falun Gong was safe from future government persecution. Jiang Zemin then issued a directive to destroy Falun Gong, considering the movement one of the biggest threats to China. On July 20th, hundreds of practitioners were rounded up, though some sources say up to 5,600 to 50,000, and detained. Falun Gong was suppressed in media, and 4 high-ranking members were charged with treason, triggering 3 days of protests in 30 cities. The creator of Falun Gong, Li Hongqi, issued a statement in July 1999, saying, "Some sources claim that I forbid people to take medicine. Actually, that is absolutely untrue. I have simply explained the relationship between cultivation practice and taking medication. I have enabled more than 100 million people to achieve health. Countless terminally ill patients have recovered and have become healthy. This is a fact. As for those who are critically ill or mentally ill, I have always advised them to not learn Falun Gong. Yet some people nonetheless insisted on learning it without my knowledge." Despite this attempt to combat government propaganda, the crackdowns continued. On Halloween 1999, China unveiled a new anti-cult law requiring, per the New China News Agency, courts, prosecutors, police, and administrative judicial organs to be on full alert for cult activities and smash them rigorously. The arrests and detaining of Falun Gong practitioners continued, and according to various reports and investigations, they'd be jailed, tortured, and executed, and sometimes subjected to organ harvesting, which China denies fully. As we discussed back in the Balkans, NATO's Operation Allied Force bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in May 1999, killing 3 people. In addition to China suspending negotiations to enter the World Trade Organization, there were massive protests in China featuring burning American flags and effigies of Bill Clinton. And the U.S. consul residence in Chengdu was set on fire. Protesters were encouraged by the Chinese government, with Vice President Hu Jintao saying, "They fully reflect the Chinese people's great fury at the atrocity of the embassy attacks by NATO and the Chinese people's strong patriotism." In the end, the U.S. paid $4.5 million to the families of the dead and injured, and a further $28 million to China for damages to the embassy. By June, rumors circulated that the bomb was retaliation for China stealing American nuclear technology, and that 2 of the victims were spies. Just a year before that bombing, the U.S. House of Representatives tasked Chris Cox with a classified investigation on China's systemic theft of American nuclear technology over decades. A redacted version of the classified report was issued a few weeks after the embassy bombing. Other observers alleged that the bombing was deliberate because the U.S. believed the Chinese to be aiding a Serbian war criminal. Regardless of the veracity of these claims, Zeman prioritized U.S.-China relations in the end, at least on the surface. While largely forgotten in the West, the incident increased Chinese nationalism and damaged the U.S.'s reputation for Chinese citizens. Through this tour of countries at the end of the 90s, we've seen congruent stories of ethnic and cultural conflicts, forced migration, propaganda and cult worship, pragmatism versus ideology, a general reorientation away from socialism to neoliberalism, and new expectations of sovereignty, human rights, and international intervention during genocide. Global bodies drafted new protocols and systems to ease centuries of mistrust and conflict, with the most powerful nations being the supreme architects and beneficiaries. Global institutions like the United Nations were disproportionately influenced by America. In 1996, after Boutros Ghali criticized the Qana massacre, in which Israelis murdered civilians at a UN safe zone, the U.S. used its veto to stop Boutros Ghali's second term as Attorney General of the United Nations, even though he ran unopposed. Wrote Robert D. McFadden. In his memoir, Mr. Boutros Ghali said the Americans had told him where not to travel, whom to avoid meeting, and what to say and not to say in speeches, and also to avoid ruffling President Bill Clinton, whom he regarded as thin-skinned and indecisive, and to stay away from Congress and soft pedal talk of America's $1.3 billion debt to the United Nations. The Ghanaian diplomat Kofi Annan succeeded Boutros Ghali. In a September 1999 speech, Annan discussed the global community's responsibility to intervene as a dilemma between the two sovereignties. While individual sovereignty or the rights of people were being strengthened at the end of history, the rights of nations or state sovereignty was being impeded by globalism and expectations to uphold individual rights over local customs and beliefs. Annan said, "In Kosovo, a group of states intervened without seeking authority from the United Nations Security Council. In Timor, the Council has now authorized intervention, but only after obtaining an invitation from Indonesia. We all hope that this will rapidly stabilize the situation, but many hundreds, probably thousands of innocent people have already perished. As in Rwanda 5 years ago, the international community stands accused of doing too little, too late." He then implored listeners to consider how global entities like the UN should proceed in the new millennium, highlighting the dual-edged blade of doing something versus doing nothing. While the battle of the sovereignties is a real issue for Western nations to parse through, especially during election years and recessions when the whims of voters are the guiding principle, those same Western nations still carried much of the blame for decades of neoliberal policies and clandestine meddling. As former chief World Bank economist Joseph E. Stiglitz argued in Globalization and Its Discontents, international bodies were responsible for economic disasters by pursuing policies that sacrificed developing nations with little transparency and regulation. By mandating shock therapy in exchange for loans at the expense of citizens and local commerce, rapid privatization of developing countries were always built on a crumbling foundation of oligarchy, organized crime, unemployment, and bailouts with more loans. No doubt recreating the circumstances requiring intervention in the first place. As we've seen so far, Clinton's intervention in the Kosovo and the Middle East at the end of the 90s was starkly different from the first few years of his foreign policy. In 1997, Clinton's new national security advisor, Samuel Berger, prioritized an undivided Europe, a strong and stable Pacific Asia, being the world's peacekeepers, opening up competitive trading, strengthening the military, and funding more diplomatic missions. Clinton's other priority was mitigating terrorism threats, which was not just a domestic issue but a foreign one. Clinton also left behind a global legacy of extraordinary rendition, or state-sponsored kidnapping a person from one nation and giving them to a third nation where they are subject to torture or execution. This began with his authorization of a 1995 arrest of a terrorist in Croatia who was sent to Egypt for execution. This policy would go gangbusters during the next decade. On January 17, 1998, the small blog Drudge Report announced that Newsweek had killed a story exposing Clinton's affair with a young intern. Reported BBC, on Saturday, Drudge published the story to the web's worldwide audience plus, according to his own calculation, his more than 85,000 subscribers. By the early hours of Sunday, the news had hit internet news groups. It moved from alt.currentevents.clinton.whitewater to alt.impeach.clinton, and then to the more mainstream political discussion groups.
You said this morning that the president did not have an improper relationship with his former intern. What do you mean by an improper relationship?
I'm not going to parse the statement. You all got the statement I made earlier, and it speaks for itself.
You're saying no relationship?
Would an improper relationship?
I'm not going to parse the statement. You've got the statement I made earlier, and it speaks for itself.
There was a trail, and there was hints all over this town that this was going down, and that's up to you guys. I'm not backing off. And again, I went with the story when no one. So I'm just one man reporting what I see, and I intend no mercy.
Added BBC, in the future, academics, politicians, and journalists aren't likely to dismiss the internet so quickly. And on my 4th birthday, January 26, 1998, Clinton said,
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never.
You can check out a more in-depth retelling of the Monica Lewinsky scandal in this video on my channel. 6 days after the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, Hillary appeared on NBC's Today Show and condemned Kenneth Starr and the vast right-wing conspiracy targeting her husband. As a result, she earned some of her highest approval ratings. In February, Clinton himself had a 72% approval rating. On March 15, 1998, a former White House volunteer named Kathleen Wiley claimed that she had been assaulted by Clinton in the Oval Office on November 29, 1993, the same day her husband died by suicide in the wake of owing over $400,000 to the IRS. Clinton claimed that he did not like small breasts and would never pursue Kathleen, while original whistleblower Linda Tripp would later testify that Kathleen Wiley had pursued a romantic relationship with Clinton. Wiley also pressured a friend to lie about the assault for her, which the friend swore to in an affidavit. Her allegations were seen as the weakest link, and Special Investigator Kenneth Starr declined to prosecute. On April 1st, 1998, a judge threw out the Paula Jones lawsuit. Also in April, Clinton announced that the deficit had been eliminated for the first time since 1969, to the nation's amazement. In June, a court ruled that the controversial Line Item Veto Act, which 2 years earlier gave the president the power to strike down portions of budget bills passed by Congress, was unconstitutional. Behind the scenes, Kenneth Starr came into possession of Monica's stained blue dress, and on July 28th, she signed an immunity deal with Starr. She began testifying on August 6th, the day before the U.S. embassy bombings occurred in Tanzania and Kenya. On August 17th, 1998, Clinton gave testimony to a grand jury admitting to an improper relationship with Monica Lewinsky, and later told the public to remember that even presidents have private lives, while apologizing. 3 days later, the U.S. began airstrikes against Afghan and Sudanese targets like the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical factory, looking for Osama bin Laden in Operation Infinite Reach. On September 9th, Kenneth Starr released his salacious and detailed $40 million report that was not well received and considered invasive and tantamount to a witch hunt. Over 140 newspapers would demand Clinton's resignation over lying about the affair, while 2/3 of polled Americans remained supportive.
Editorial writers, columnists, television reporters, and commentators have a very different view of the political arena than the public as a whole. The view of the chattering class, as we sometimes call the editorial writers and the columnists, has been harshly against Bill Clinton for many, many months. And they've certainly gone out of their way to convince the American people that that's how they ought to view things.
If anybody else in the armed forces did what he did, they would lose his job. He's the head of the armed forces. I kind of think it follows. He should lose his job. I mean, if anybody else, if a CEO of a corporation, if I did it, I'd lose my job.
I believe if every official, public official that we elected would resign for lying, we wouldn't have any government. So I don't know if it's all that important that he resign. I know that he's apologizing now, and that's good. That is important.
Why should it surprise anybody that a liar is going to be thrown out of office? George Bush was thrown out of office for lying and breaking his no new taxes pledge. Why should we be any less kind to President Clinton on that regard? He's lied to the American people. He lied to our face. He lied to our Congress. He lied to the courts. He's not worthy of the office, whether we forgive him for his private behavior or not.
So where do you come down? Do you feel that he should be censored? Do you feel that this should lead to an impeachment proceeding?
Absolutely not impeachment. I do think that, now this is radical, that perhaps we ought to have a witch hunt and expose everybody, especially those people that are after him the most.
Though I agree that Clinton is definitely morally deficient in this area. We knew that in 1996, and the people could have chosen Dole, but Clinton was overwhelmingly selected.
Clinton's approval rating hovered at 62%, while 36% of respondents in one poll believed that Clinton was pulling a wag the dog style conspiracy. The movie Wag the Dog, in which the president distracts the country from his sex scandal with a faux war against terrorists in Albania, debuted 1 month before the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke. So after Operation Infinite Reach, Wag the Dog became much more relevant to those who thought Clinton was waging war to distract from the scandals that had mounted since Lewinsky-gate. Reporters even asked Secretary of Defense William Cohen in August if Clinton was doing a Wag the Dog. As Clinton refused to resign, the House moved to impeach. On October 9th, all 227 Republicans in the House, along with 31 Democrats, voted to impeach Clinton for lying under oath about his affair with Monica Lewinsky, committing perjury, and obstructing justice. 167 Democrats voted against the impeachment. The Senate would begin a trial in January 1999 and ultimately refused to convict, and Clinton remained president. This was a blow to Republicans like their showings in the 1998 congressional elections. They expected the public to rally behind them and against the Clintons, but instead, Republicans lost 5 seats to narrowly maintain a majority. It was the first time since 1934 that an opposition party failed to win additional congressional seats in a midterm election. A coalition of Republicans nearly rebelled against House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who resigned. He said, "I'm willing to lead, but I'm not willing to preside over people who are cannibals. My only fear would be that if I tried to stay, it would just overshadow whoever my successor is. Frankly, Mary Ann and I could use a break." At the time, Gingrich was cheating on his terminally ill wife Mary Ann with a woman 23 years younger than him. On November 13th, 1998, Clinton agreed to a settlement to pay Paula Jones $850,000 to drop her appeal without admitting wrongdoing or apologizing. Most of the money would go to Jones's lawyers. Clinton must have thought his problems were over, but more of his past behavior was back to haunt him. On December 20th, 1998, Juanita Broaddrick alleged to Lisa Myers of NBC that she had been raped by Clinton when he was the Arkansas Attorney General in 1978, though the story wouldn't air until February 24th, 1999, after the impeachment trial. Wrote Philip Weiss, "My friend's suspicion that NBC protected Mr. Clinton is widely shared. Recently, the National Press Club held a panel on the Broaddrick story, too hot for a scandal-weary new media to handle, where several speakers made that point. Conservative media watchdog Reed Irvine charged in the Washington Times that NBC delayed the story because executives are cozy with the president. And TV Guide has questioned why NBC's apparent hesitation to run the interview cost it a scoop to the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Said NBC Vice President Bill Wheatley, who insisted the outlet needed more time to vet the story. The fact that neither Ken Starr nor the House managers had done much with the Broaddrick allegation was pointed to by some as a cautionary tale. It was argued if these blood enemies of the president didn't act on her story, perhaps there was a problem with it. Said the New York Times, there is no physical evidence to verify it. No one else was present during the alleged encounter in a Little Rock hotel room nearly 21 years ago. The hotel has since closed, and Mrs. Broaddrick denied the encounter in an affidavit in January 1998 in the Paula Jones case, in which she was known only as Jane Doe No. 5. Through all those years, she refused to come forward. When pressed by the Jones lawyers, she denied the allegation, and now she has recanted that denial. Bill Clinton accusers were often painted as conservative puppets, and people who believed the women who accused him of assault were grouped with conservative conspiracy cultists. The backdrop of the Clinton administration has been mired with conspiracy theories and culture, as we've covered in this series, where anything remotely left-leaning was painted as evil and sick. If you recall our discussion of Colorado Senator Gary Hart during the 1988 election, you remember that a new insatiable thirst for the private lives of politicians had emerged, which conservatives sought to exploit to discredit Democrats while ignoring their own foibles and atrocities. Throughout Clinton's impeachment process, a number of Republicans, including Gingrich, were embarrassed when their own personal tea about infidelity and sexual harassment was spilled. Penthouse editor Larry Flint offered cash for credible infidelity stories about Republican congresspeople who voted to impeach Clinton. Remember Idaho Senator Helen Chenoweth? Days after she started issuing Clinton impeachment ads, she admitted to having an affair with a married former business partner in the 80s. And not just any affair, baby. They were banging for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. Divulged the Tampa Bay Times. Chenoweth's admission comes 6 days after Indiana Representative Dan Burton, who acknowledged to the Indianapolis Star and News that he fathered a son during an extramarital affair in the early 80s. In both cases, the lawmakers confessed to long-rumored conduct once it was clear their local papers would be publishing stories about it. On the other hand, Clinton's lies and patterns of extramarital consensual affairs at best showed that he was a lying and cheating scoundrel with poor impulse control, and at worst that he was indeed a rapist. 20, 30, 100, 200, etc. years previously, this label wouldn't have made the headlines in any nation, let alone become media fodder to be corroborated or denied, which is a ghastly indictment of humanity's long-term misogyny and sitting president's influence over media. But in 1998, at the end of history, as rape culture was addressed in public forums and America poised itself as a champion of human rights, an enforcer of liberty, and a leader of the New World Order, Clinton's ongoing sex scandals meant a new line in the sand was being drawn between what was acceptable in an American president and what wasn't, at least on the surface. In the end, Americans were left to draw their own conclusions about Clinton scandals, usually with much of the stories obscured by bigger world events or general media fatigue. As would come to be expected in American politics, too many scandals eventually means people stop caring. The U.S. budget was balanced for the first time in 30 years. International relations seemed rosy. Abortion was legal or close to being illegal, depending on how you looked at it. Crime was down, and the future sparkled with internet, blockbuster movies, increasingly niche forms of entertainment, and roaring end of the millennium parties to attend. Sure, there were peripheral threats like gun-packing teenagers in school hallways and men with Arabic names bombing U.S. embassies in far-off locations, but the future seemed bright, thanks to one of the nation's youngest presidents. A young president who smoked weed before, excelled at oratory rhetoric, never served in a war, mingled with celebrities, and made oral sex a topic of mainstream conversation. A man who hired women and minorities into places of power. A man who didn't seem intimidated by his ambitious wife when she was publicly exalted as a bitch. And a man who empowered the powerful victims' right lobby by being pro-death penalty. A man who remained the best chance for feminist advancement in a period just 2 decades removed from the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment, and 2 decades before a rapist reality TV show host with numerous failed businesses beat out a former Secretary of State in a presidential race bloated with misogyny. At the end of history, America had changed, but certainly not enough to make Clinton's scandals a deal breaker. The alleged rape of a woman in 1978 seemed irrelevant, or yet another attempt by conservative foes to topple a Democratic president guiding the country into the future with agility and finesse. Clinton's approval rating stayed at 66% following the Broderick allegations. And here lies one of Bill Clinton's greatest accomplishments as president, setting the tone for how to dodge accountability during a period of increased transparency, conspiracy theories, and media pontification. Presidents had finessed public opinion before, but never with the threat of the internet looming overhead. Wag the Dog was fiction, but the president's ability to spin or recalibrate, redirect, and revitalize his support system changed the future of American politics. Clinton was the first Democrat since Roosevelt to win consecutive elections, and his Teflon survival during the Lewinsky and Jones scandals were a demonstration of what was to come from future politicians. Who would follow the great triangulator Bill Clinton? Could anyone continue the trend of a balanced budget? Vice President Al Gore, champion of the environment and internet, would certainly throw his hat in the ring. Ralph Nader of the Green Party wanted in, and Pat Buchanan, who dramatically left the Republicans in October 1999, was ready to give it another try on a reformist ticket against fellow candidates Jesse Ventura and Donald Trump. Down in Texas, the ferocious governor and tough-on-crime baseball team owner George W. Bush was ready to espouse family values after a decade of liberal excess. Bush's coalition of advisors like Karl Rove had been drumming up support for him from the early 90s onward. Popular vote be damned.
4, 3, 2, 1, happy 2000!
In spite of the decade's tragedies, the ongoing civil wars, a recent protest of the World Trade Organization in Seattle by an estimated 30,000 people, and apocalyptic prophecies about the Y2K bug, which was diligently solved by a global network of computer engineers, humans gathered to celebrate the coming new millennium. In China, Jiang Zemin lit a flame in celebration of Chinese history, while Jackie Chan sang before a fireworks show in Hong Kong. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela visited the cell he spent 27 years of his life in and lit a flame. The Russian people celebrated the new year with their new leader, Vladimir Putin. People in Paris celebrated as 20,000 lights pulsed from the Eiffel Tower. In the UK, Queen Elizabeth held hands with her hubby Philip and Tony Blair to the tune of Auld Lang Syne at the opening of the Millennium Dome. It cost nearly £800 billion to construct, it barely attracted visitors and was considered a colossal failure, and the London Eye, or the Millennium Wheel banked on the River Thames, was more popular. In New York City, Times Square hosted its 96th annual ball drop. And in DC, Bill Clinton and thousands of citizens attended the Washington Monument Y2K celebration as America said goodbye to the 90s and the 1900s. Which model of government would thrive in the new century? American? Chinese? Venezuelan? Russian? Israeli? Cuban? No matter what social ideology was declared or implemented, every nation was linked in the global economy. Francis Fukuyama theorized back in 1989 that the communist challenge to liberalism was dead, predicting a new era of camaraderie in the 90s. On one hand, he was correct that the linked fate of these nations in the global marketplace made them have shared interests and limited the circumstances under which direct aggressive action would be accepted. Additionally, the end of the Cold War and the economic trends of the 90s proved that no nation was purely capitalistic or socialist. No nation was pure, no leader clean of blood on his or her hands, and no group free of conflict or dissent. Certainly not in America, which loved to find ways to fill an enforcer role. In 1998, when an undercover team of Department of Interior officials found widespread trafficking, forced abortion, slave labor, and abuse of minors on the American territory, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, they wrote, "Our country is in a poor position to criticize other countries for violating their citizens' human rights when we deny their citizens basic rights in the CNMI and cheat and physically abuse them as well. But hypocrisy is woven into the fabric of America as much as violence and entitlement," said Madeleine Albright that same year in a quote that would be laughable just 3 years later. "If we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall and we see farther than other countries into the future." But America was not alone in its atrocities, nor was it the source of all the world's ills. That same year, when 120 countries voted to create a permanent international criminal court to prosecute individuals for genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, 7 countries voted against it. China, Iraq, Israel, Libya, Qatar, the US, and Yemen all wanted to avoid their leaders being arrested for their various crimes. A dark reminder of the state of geopolitics regardless of ideology, religion, or culture. History was far from over. The communist boogeyman hadn't been replaced, but rather overshadowed by the Islamic terrorists. Accordingly, challenges to Western liberalism were also far from over. A bomb had been ticking during the decades that Muslims had been targeted, moved from their lands, and persecuted by Judeo-Christian nationalists ruled by white supremacy and imperialism. When the ball dropped into the new millennium, we were less than 2 years away from an event that would change the trajectory of American history and lead to a violent campaign of slaughter in the Middle East, with former anti-government militia members wielding the guns and bombs in the name of American freedom. Also at the end of the decade, former communist powers China and Russia were recalibrating in a capitalist market, both ready to offer diplomacy and resources to nations suffering from US sanctions. And they were both poised to enter and exit the 2000s larger than ever before, but still dealing with citizens and territories who desired their own autonomy and even democracy. Conservative American racists, suffering under the diverse, liberalized, and feminized culture of the Clinton era, were learning to evolve after tussling with the triangulating comeback kid, whose neoliberalism shifted the Overton window to the right. As for Clinton, his achievements would be denied by Republicans and his failures would be obscured by Democrats. When Clinton left the White House, there was a $256 billion budget surplus. But as Joseph Stiglitz explored in his book, The Roaring '90s, the Clinton-era economy of growth on the cheap, radical deficit reduction, and abundant middle-class tax credits that didn't fundamentally address poverty was not built on a sustainable foundation, especially when paired with ongoing deregulation and privatization. No, history was far from over. How would all of this be erased in the patriotic post-9/11 era? It'll be fun and scary to talk about when I do the 2000s eventually. Preparing and creating this series was one of the greatest joys of my life, and now it's time for me to move on, or rather move backwards. Before I do, I want to leave you with some questions. How did your location impact your understanding of your position, not just within your culture, family, city, state, and nation, but the world? Do you remember all of these events that we've covered in this series? How will you apply what you've learned in this series to your everyday life? How much of this was missing from your primary or even secondary education? And I dare you, go watch CNN's The 90s, come back to me and tell me how much of this shit that I was talking about was missing from their series. Go read any 90s book, go watch any 90s documentary, and ask yourself, why was all of this shit missing from their narratives? How many of these ethnic groups or people had you never heard of before watching this series? Why does this matter? isn't the world bigger and more complex than we give it credit for? Isn't it more complicated than the 19th and 20th century ideas of dead white men who never witnessed reality TV, celebrity culture, or social media, or dreamed to fathom that abhorrent material conditions aren't enough to scrape together a race-blind, gender-neutral, religiously inclusive coalition powerful enough to challenge the state? Sorry. This series was dense and mainly about one nation in one period of time, and it still wasn't all-encompassing, which means imagine the wealth of context in every nation I breezed through in this episode. Make sure to check out the list of sources and additional resources for this series over on Patreon to deepen your understanding. It cost over $20,000 for video editing, music and image licensing, research, and more to create this series, and I don't regret it. If you enjoyed Lexual Does the 90s and need more, order my books, Lexual Does the 90s and the companion guide, I Love the 90s. You can get my books on my website and also on Amazon. And don't forget to request copies at your local library. These books feature all the history we've covered in this series, plus even more facts and context. If you want more 90s content in the meantime, subscribe to my Patreon for the series glossaries, study guides, and syllabi. How well do you think you know the 90s after watching this series? Check out the trivia quiz and other content like playlists, videos deemed too hot for YouTube, encyclopedia entries, and more over on my website, intellectualmedia.com. As our historical journey expands on this channel, region and location will become even more important. With this foundation of general 70s, 80s, and 90s history I've established over the past 7 years, we can go deeper. And I look forward to getting really, really specific. Thank you so much for watching this series, and I hope you like, comment, and subscribe.